Welcome to the Rewilding Hope Land and Sea Conference. I was really looking forward to doing this in my t-shirt that says Rewilding on it in the sun, but look at this. Hey, we're all flexible. The timing for this conference couldn't have been better. The 5th of June marks World Environment Day and the 8th of June is World Oceans Day. We are smack in the middle as well in the United Nations Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. For the next 2 days, you'll be hearing from leading experts working with amazing organizations about a host of inspiring projects. Rewilding Hope. The title for the conference couldn't have been chosen better. When you listen to the news, admit it, sometimes it's easy to lose hope in humanity. But when you focus on nature and on the many people around the world who are so passionately engaged in rewilding, in restoring and protecting nature, you cannot help but be filled with hope. Quick note about me. I'm Daniel Martin Eckhart and I run a newsletter on LinkedIn. It's called the Rewilder Weekly. If you're interested, if rewilding is your world, or if you're new to the topic, come join me. Once a week you'll be hearing stories about rewilding and you'll inevitably get a dose of hope. So no doubt you'll find a link in the comments somewhere to subscribe. Before we get going, thanks. A special thanks go to the Rewilding Hope organizing team. Thanks to Climate Action North, and a special thanks to Sharon Lashley, who invited me instead of her to give this introduction. Thanks a lot, Sharon. Thanks also go to Rewilding Britain, to Northumberland Wildlife Trust, and of course to the many wonderful speakers and their organizations. And now, let's get going. Let's rewild the world.
Hello, everyone, and thank you to Sharon for letting us provide a bit of an introduction to today's fantastic conference on Rewilding Hope Land and Sea. My name is Sarah King, and I'm Rewilding Manager at Rewilding Britain, and I'm just going to provide you with a bit of an introduction into what we're talking about when we're thinking about rewilding and how it brings so much hope, not just in terms of nature recovery, but in terms of our own health and well-being as well. So I like to start with this illustration because I think it's really important to acknowledge the journey that we've taken with how we connect with nature. And historically, we've always seen ourselves as very much part of that ecosystem, living and working within wild nature. But over the last few decades, we've started to see those threads pull apart. And really, I think as a whole, we've lost some of that connection with nature and we see ourselves as possibly separate from an ecosystem. Through rewilding, what we want to see is those threads coming back together and us really starting to understand that we have a place within ecosystems. We need to work with nature as a part of those natural processes. And actually, through doing that, we can thrive just as much as wildlife can. So the world that we want to see going forward is one where there's a lot more nature, a lot more wilder areas, but also that we are very much a part of that ecosystem again, and we can get that nature connectedness back. So how can we let natural processes lead? This is a key part of rewilding. We're not managing for a particular habitat or a particular species. We're very much trying to reinstate natural processes and then letting nature take the lead. So to do this, natural processes need space, and we need to think at the landscape and seascape scale to allow nature to have that space to create these dynamic ecosystems to function as they should. And so the first point we need to think about is how do we give natural processes the space to create these dynamic ecosystems? Natural processes also need all the puzzle pieces in place. So I quite like to think about a Jenga tower. And if you imagine over time, we've taken some of those blocks out, whether that's taking out some species that are now missing, like our large predators, or whether it's straightening rivers. We're taking those blocks out, and what we have is quite a shaky tower. So when we have extreme weather events or we're seeing climate change having an impact on our ecosystems, they're not very resilient, they're quite shaky. So what we want to do through rewilding is try and put some of those blocks back into the Jenga tower, making it more resilient to this change. And we do that by mimicking natural processes. So that might be mimicking coppicing if we can't bring bison and beavers back. We might be mimicking beavers through leaky dams. We might re-wiggle rivers. Sometimes we might need to harvest animals if we haven't got any of our predators here. And we might have land management techniques like sustainable forestry through continuous canopy harvesting to try and mimic the role that large herbivores might have had within that woodland, pushing trees down and creating deadwood. We might also want to try and do some interventions to actually restore those natural processes. So things like rewiggling rivers, as I've already mentioned, but also species reintroduction. So bringing back some of those keystone species to restore that tower and make it more resilient. And that's really what we're doing through rewilding, is trying to build back up those natural processes to then allow nature to lead the way. And we often get asked, have we got the space? You know, we live in a densely populated country, we're a small island, we don't have space to rewild. Well, at Rewilding Britain, we're calling for 30% of Britain to be in nature recovery by 2030. And this will comprise of 5% core rewilding areas, so where natural processes are really being allowed to lead the way, and then 25% of semi-wild areas. So nature recovery is still happening across those areas, and that's on land and sea. We have to remember in Britain that 86% of our land is non-urban, 70% of our land is in farmland. And what we're looking at when we're rewilding is not to rewild all of those areas, but to look at the lowest productivity areas for food, where it's really difficult to produce food, and think about, is there a better use for that? So in England, we're looking at things like grade 4 and 5 agricultural land, where it's really difficult to produce food. Maybe they're better suited for rewilding and nature recovery instead. And actually in England, the National Food Strategy said that we could take out 20% of our land and give that over to nature and only lose 3% of our calories. But the benefits that rewilding can bring in terms of clean water, clean air, not just nature recovery, but also our own well-being, are huge. So it's really rethinking about the choices we want to make for land use, and where we can give some space back to nature to allow us to get the benefits that brings. And we also have to remember that we do have degraded landscapes. Britain ranks really low in the Biodiversity Intactness Index. We're 189th out of 240 countries. And so we really need to think about, how do we start to build that back up and restore those natural processes. And keystone species have a big role to play in this. So keystone species have a big impact on their ecosystem. So it could include a beaver that's called an ecosystem engineer, where wetlands are created, diversity is created. It can include top predators, such as wolves and lynx. It can also, in our seas, include whales that can drive ecological processes and make a big difference across the whole food chain. And this is called a trophic cascade. But keystone species are not all predators, and they don't always flow top to bottom. So we've got things like wild boar that can rootle around, create opportunities for a whole range of animals. And even keystone species could include things like wood ants that have a key role to play within that ecosystem and could create opportunities for other biodiversity. So rewilding isn't just about species reintroductions, but it's important to understand what the role of keystone species can have, what we're missing from our ecosystems, and if we can't bring some of those species back, how can we mimic those natural processes to allow nature to lead the way as much as possible? And I think one of the most exciting things is that we can start to see a whole range of unique, different opportunities and approaches to rewilding. And I'm just going to play this video that shows some of the projects across the whole of Britain that are rewilding land. They're each unique in their own way. We can see nature developing differently. We've got different species returning. And I think that's what makes it really exciting, is that no project is the same. Everyone's innovating, taking different approaches and seeing what happens. And to be able to see that and experience it is incredible. And we just realize how much we still have to learn about nature. And if we put nature in the driving seat, it really does thrive, and we can see all of the species that return that we wouldn't necessarily expect to see. Oh, sorry. And we really do see a kaleidoscope of different approaches. So here's another snapshot of some of the rewilding projects across Britain. And not only do we see different approaches, whether it's tree planting in the Highlands of Scotland to create a seed source to then allow natural regeneration, whether it's bringing different herbivores into lowland England. So there's a few photos here of the Knepp estate that's creating a diverse mosaic of wood pasture habitats, through to heathlands, salt marshes, marine environments. We really do start to see a whole range of different approaches that are happening here. And I think what's also really exciting is that not only are we restoring natural processes and having these unique different approaches to that, we start to see that dynamic landscapes and seascapes can be created. So when you go to these rewilding areas, you wouldn't expect to see habitats in one particular state throughout the year. You would expect to see it change when the grazing animals move in. They might create some open areas. They might move out of some areas for a bit of time, which allows that scrub and woodland to grow up. So really, we want to see this kaleidoscope, ever-changing landscape once we've got those natural processes in place. And that then creates a whole load of opportunities for wildlife. And also we can see the benefits that rewilding is having on people. So through the Rewilding Network, we are trying to bring together the evidence base for rewilding. And we can start to see the impact that that has. So not only are we seeing more visitors to a lot of these rewilding landscapes, but we're also supporting jobs so that people can live and work within these areas. So we're seeing a large increase in job opportunities, not just more jobs within rewilding areas, but also a whole diversity of different jobs, from ecologists to tourism, rangers, cafe workers, campsite workers, a whole range of diverse different jobs that are supported across these rewilding projects. And we're also seeing more volunteers going out and working on these rewilding projects, enjoying the areas, getting really involved with it and knowing what's happening and witnessing the nature that comes back, which can help our own well-being as well. We know how important green spaces are for our own health. So it's incredibly important to see the role that people have within these rewilding landscapes. It's very much not a case of closing the gate and walking away, but seeing that people can be part of this and reconnect with nature once again. And I think it's important to acknowledge that we do have a growing movement of rewilding across Britain, and it's fantastic to see all the different people coming on board who want to innovate, who want to try new things and rewild land and sea. But I think we do need to acknowledge that there is a time of uncertainty and change, especially with the new agricultural policies coming through. So it's really important to bring landowners, land managers, farmers and communities together to support each other and to share in the hope that rewilding can bring. And I'm very lucky to work with a network of rewilding projects across the whole of Britain, some of which are shown on this map. We now have over 170,000 hectares of land in rewilding. We see an increasing amount of marine rewilding projects coming through as well. And as you can see on the map, we've got a spread of rewilding projects across the whole of Britain, and that's growing week on week. So it's fantastic to see rewilding spreading as a movement. It's growing in terms of the amount of land and sea dedicated to rewilding, but also to see people come together and share the hope that rewilding can bring. We also have a series of local and national networks who we work closely with, who are working hard to bring rewilding together at the local level. And Sharon runs the Northeast Network as well, who are also part of the network. So if anyone wants to get involved with their local network, it's definitely worth checking out those initiatives as well. So I wanted to spend a bit of time as well just to look at, what does rewilding look like? What are we thinking about when we're imagining these landscapes and seascapes and the change that we want to see? And I want to start by going to Europe, because Rewilding Europe and the projects that are happening on the continent are quite far ahead of us in Britain. And we can take real inspiration from what they're doing and the change that they're seeing and start to apply some of those principles back in Britain. So I'm just going to go through some of the illustrations of some of the Rewilding Europe landscapes, just to give a bit of inspiration for what we could have here if we wanted to make those decisions about land uses. So this is an illustration of the Danube Delta, which is a wetland ecosystem where hydrology has been restored. Animals have been brought back, including water buffalo, to create those dynamic landscapes and graze and browse the areas, create wallows, open up some water areas, and really just create more diversity. But the project also focuses on some keystone species, including pelicans. There's a LIFE project that's been trying to bring back pelicans and support pelican recovery in the area. And that's had massive successes in terms of pelican populations. And what you can see within this illustration is not just the amount of life that is coming back to the area, but also people within this landscape, whether that's tourism opportunities, other nature-based enterprises, people living and working within it, and being able to not only explore these areas, but also have their own enterprises and local economies from it. So I think it's really exciting to have a look at this illustration and think, you know, could this be the Somerset Levels or some of our other wetland areas, what could we do to imagine maybe even having pelicans back on the Somerset Levels and seeing the impact that that might have? Another Rewilding Europe landscape is the Southern Carpathians. So you can see this is a slightly different landscape. It's more of an upland, mountainous landscape where wolves have returned, bison have been restored to the area. And we very much see a very wooded valley here, but with patches of grassland and wildflowers where the grazing animals have got in and opened it up. But there again, there are still people within this landscape. There's people living, farming within this landscape. And what we want to see is a mosaic of rewilding areas alongside farmland and where people are living as well. And then finally, another illustration from the Greater Coa Valley in Portugal, where again, we see this kind of savanna wood pasture type habitat where we have a mixture of trees, scrub, grassland. Again, grazing animals have been brought back. So there's semi-wild herds of ponies, for example. And they've also had a really successful reintroduction program for the Iberian lynx, which is a massive success story and can really bring hope in terms of how we restore some of these threatened species and the role that they can have within these areas. And the Greater Coa Valley have reported massive successes in terms of bringing people back to the rural areas that have once been abandoned, working and living once again within these rewilding landscapes. So how does that apply to Britain? It's good to kind of think about how can we then start to apply it back here? What sort of things might we want to look at if we were to rewild land in Britain at a significant level? And here at Rewilding Britain, we've drawn an illustration, used our imagination to think about what a rewilding landscape could look like. And this is just a generic upland valley that we've had a little bit of fun with to try and think about what could rewilding look like in this area. So you can see that the river's been rewiggled, it's been given the space within the floodplain to create this braiding effect that we start to see. We've also got beavers within this landscape. They've created a dam holding back the water, creating a whole load of complex wetlands that not just help with flood mitigation, but also in the dry summers we're seeing, provides an oasis of water in an otherwise dry landscape. We can see the hills are covered in trees, regenerating, scrub, with some open grassland areas. We've got some species that have returned. So we've got a lynx lounging in the tree. We've got wildcats that have come back, pine martins. We've also got eagles. I quite like the eagle flying off with a wild boar in its talons. So, you know, we've used our imagination for this, but I think it's just an exciting view of what some of our hills could look like if we were to choose to rewild them. We've also got things like green bridges here to help with connectivity across the landscape. And there's very much still people living within this landscape. There's buildings down at the bottom, there's roads. We would love to see people visiting, enjoying this imaginary landscape and also working within it and supporting those jobs that we're already seeing across the network. And this conference is very much looking at connecting land and sea. And so when we're thinking about rewilding, we do need to think about the system, the whole system level. How can what actions happen on land and how can that affect marine areas? How is that affecting our rivers? And rivers are very much in the news at the moment. We know the impact that we're having on those, but trying to think about how can we change that and how can we look at the whole system is vitally important. So it's fantastic to be part of this conference, hearing about how land and sea are being rewilded and influencing each other. So this illustration is really just to show the connection that we have between land, whether we're rewilding our uplands, our lowlands, whether we're improving water quality in our rivers through rewiggling them, braiding them, bringing beavers back into them that can help not only, again, with flood mitigation, but with water quality. And ultimately that affects our sea as well and our marine ecosystems. There's a lot of work happening to restore marine ecosystems, whether it's bringing back oysters, whether it's seagrass restoration, kelp restoration, but that can only really be successful if we make sure that we are also rewilding land and thinking at the catchment scale. So if we've got lots of pollution in our rivers, lots of sediment flowing into our marine ecosystems, then that is going to choke these areas, and seagrass in particular requires sunlight to come through to those seagrass beds. And if the water's full of pollutants or sediment, the sunlight simply isn't going to get through. So when we're restoring these areas, we really need to think about how do we connect land and sea? How do we think of the system level? And just think about the complexity of the ecosystem and how everything is interconnected. And I'm sure we're going to hear much more about some of those projects that are connecting land and sea over the course of this conference. So I just want to go back to the illustration that I showed a couple of slides ago and just challenge everyone listening to this conference to think about how can we have wilder areas in areas that are suitable for it. So low productivity farmland, for example. Where can we start to dedicate space to allow nature to thrive and to put nature in the driving seat, restoring those natural processes? I'm really thinking about not only is this important for nature recovery, but it's also important for us and for our connection with nature. And we know how important nature is to our own well-being. And I'd love to think about how can we be a bit wilder in Britain and how can we restore some of these fantastic areas. So I just want to leave you with that and with the challenge that to rewild land in Britain, we do need to make some significant choices, but the benefits that we can get from that are huge. So I'd challenge everyone to think big and act wild. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much indeed, Sharon, for inviting me along today. So I'm going to be talking about something in the rewilding world that's a little bit different, something that I think we all need to think more about and quite frankly, be better at. I spent much of what is very loosely referred to as my career as a nature photographer, freelance conservation photographer. So my journey into the world of rewilding has been unconventional in many ways. I didn't go to university. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an ologist, zoologist, ecologist, biologist. But today I head up a charity called Scotland the Big Picture. And our mission is to make rewilding happen across Scotland. And we do that in two ways. We have two focus areas. We drive support for rewilding and we commit more of Scotland's land and water to rewilding. I think what makes Scotland the Big Picture perhaps slightly different, dare I say even unique, is our background. As I said, I worked as a freelance nature photographer, and our core team comes from a background of environmental communications, photographers, writers, designers, and filmmakers. We were storytellers effectively long before we were rewilders. And still today, we believe passionately in the power of compelling communications to help turn the tide for nature recovery. It is true to say that we like nothing more than filling a room full of people and telling them inspiring stories. Now, that might sound a little bit frivolous, but there is some strategy behind it. So this is our definition of rewilding. I hope that it feels credible. I hope that it feels scientific. Perhaps it feels a little bit corporate. It's the sort of thing that you would perhaps trot out in a media interview. But what it doesn't do is excite me. It doesn't move me. And actually, in many ways, I don't think it's even accurate, because long before we get to restoring ecosystems, the physical process, rewilding relies on a reset in the way that we perceive and relate to the landscapes around us and the species that share our space. Fundamentally, rewilding requires a complete shift in mindset and in the way that we perceive and interact with wild nature. I think its appeal effectively is in hope. It's in excitement. It's in inspiration. Its appeal is in our imaginations. People buy into rewilding because they need hope. They need a sense of a better future. And perhaps they instinctively feel that the obligation, if you like, to repair and recover what we've broken. And that's why we place so much emphasis on driving support, driving support for rewilding using impactful communications, engagement, and advocacy, storytelling effectively. I think as rewilders, we need to understand what motivates people. What buttons do we need to press to get them to make different choices? How do we catalyze that reimagined relationship with wild nature? And of course, there's no magic wand. We're not pretending that there is. But more often than not, it's not by speaking to the head. It's not by, we shouldn't rely on people making logical, rational, scientific choices with our head. It's more about speaking to the heart. Human beings are generally motivated by emotion, intuition, instinct, a complex cocktail of values that shape our choices and decision making. People sometimes say to me that it must be great having a job working with sexy wildlife species. And I say, yeah, absolutely, that must be great. But that's not what I do. For the most part, my work is with just one species, this one, because this is the species that holds the key to the rewilding door. The recovery of nature in the UK rests with people. We believe rewilding is 20% ecology and 80% psychology. The practical idea of rewilding, the stuff on the ground, is relatively simple. But the social, cultural, economic, and philosophical landscape that rewilding must navigate is anything but simple, because people aren't simple. So the battleground, if indeed there is one, is not about ecosystem health, function, and completeness. It's about hearts and minds. And to win that battle, we need to understand people's values. My own journey in this space goes back about 30 years now, when I covered a story on the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone in the States. This is back in the early 90s. And I traveled to the States a number of times and spoke to lots of people about wolves, families, researchers, scientists, hunters, ranchers, a whole range of different people about their views on wolves. And it was really interesting because quite quickly conversations turned from conversations that were about wolves to conversations about how people frame wolves in their minds. Many Americans felt that reintroducing wolves was simply an issue of righting an historic wrong, while others resented their return, feeling that these animals were being imposed on rural communities, that those communities were being deprived of the power, if you like, to make their own decisions and shape their own destinies. They were being undermined, belittled. The return of wolves was seen by some people as an affront on the very identity of rural America. And as I've traveled to different parts of the world, exploring this bizarre and twisted and skewed and bewildered and ultimately fascinating interface between people and nature, that same story has played out again and again and again. So it might be wolves in Montana, it might be bears in Finland, it might be hen harriers in Scotland, it might be beavers in Scotland, red deer in Scotland. The backdrop and the characters might change, but the people story, the human story, remains pretty much the same. I genuinely don't think that the ranchers I spoke to in the US, or at least not all of them, hated wolves necessarily, but they resented the challenge to their custodianship of the land. They rallied against those people far away in city offices who they didn't know, who they didn't trust, who had never walked a mile in their shoes, but who were nevertheless making decisions that threatened their way of life. It felt like an attack on their values. So while here in the UK, rewilding is seen by many people, I guess most of this audience, as a transformational approach to addressing the dual crises of climate breakdown and global biodiversity loss, some people see rewilding as an ideology imposed on rural communities without respect or understanding of cultural heritage. For some people, the term itself has implications of an uncultivated or uninhabited state, suggesting the threat of nature replacing people. Here in Scotland, that has echoes of the clearances. But whatever rewilding might mean, there are lots of people out there who are sure that they don't like it. But again, I don't think the enemy is rewilding. I think the enemy is change. Just like with wolves in America, many traditional rural communities feel that change is being done to them rather than for them or with them. they don't hate rewilding as such, but they resent that challenge to their custodianship of the land. It's not about wolves or beavers or lynx or trees. It's about change. And asking people to change is a big ask. It's much bigger than perhaps we imagine it to be. And the older we get, the more difficult that challenge is. I would say that overcoming the fear of or resistance to change is one of our biggest challenges. Rewilding represents change to the landscape, but it also represents a social change, cultural change, ideological change. Change can create fear, and fear creates resentment. When you're in the business, as I think we all are, as I certainly am, of changing perceptions, changing mindset, there's another actor in this space that I think we underestimate in many ways, and that's the popular media. The media could frame rewilding as a progressive pathway to a nature-rich future, but instead, generally speaking, it chooses to fuel misconceptions, inflame conflict, if you like, by reducing rewilding to simplified elements such as large predators or rural depopulation. They relentlessly demonize wildlife. And what that does is deepens our fears, makes us even more resistant to change, resenting change. And it further alienates us, if you like, from our place in the natural order. Predators, deer numbers, grouse moors, they're all ingredients in the rewilding discussion, of course, but these sensationalist headlines around these contested areas, they do nothing to tease out the complexity and nuance that is inherent in rewilding and people's attitudes to it. So often across the spaces where rewilding is discussed, that complexity and nuance is lost. Entrenched opinions are delivered with very little tolerance for different perspectives. And we certainly see this as a limiting factor in driving support for rewilding. And it's especially true on social media, where the only currency seems to be right and wrong, for and against. Are you one of us or are you one of them? And this is an example of what that looks like. I'm sure, like all of you, I see hundreds of these types of posts. They're lazy, they're generalizations, they do nothing except perpetuate prejudice, mistrust, and division. Here's another. This constant cycle of bomb throwing, stone throwing, finger pointing, where people's opinions are presented as facts, it undermines our ability to have measured, respectful, and progressive conversations. This is an interesting post. I'll just let you read it. There's this perception that rewilders, whoever they may be, are somehow out to undermine the indigenous population, whoever they may be. That's an undefinable term. And somehow somebody needs protecting from something. For me, this post, and I've seen many like it, confirms that the biggest barrier to rewilding is the threat of change and who's seen to be driving that change. We really do have to get past this. We have to do better. We have to stop throwing bombs at each other across social media. And from a rewilder's point of view, we need to better understand why people feel and think that the way they do. We have to get past this notion that rewilding is a binary choice between the needs of nature and the needs of people. We believe that pitching one against the other will serve neither. So what does that actually look like? Excuse me. This is in many ways Scotland's wolf, white-tailed seagull, of course, on Skye. We hunted these birds to extinction in 1918. So for me, their return over the last 30 years or so is a cause for celebration. I believe that seagulls have a right to be here. This is David. He's a sheep farmer in Argyll who has a different perspective on eagles. I interviewed David a few years ago, and we disagreed on many things. but we also found common ground. And crucially, I went away having learned a little bit more about the challenges of a sheep farmer, and David went away having learned a bit more about the opportunities brought about by rewilding. We were prepared to walk a mile in each other's shoes. Now, these conversations are not easy, but I believe we have to be brave and we have to have them. And we have to have them in a respectful, progressive, constructive framework. People's values, which is really at the heart of this stuff, are deeply entrenched. They form from the very day that we're born. They're shaped by our parents, our upbringing, our education, our social background, our peer groups, and even our religious persuasions. These things all shape what we believe to be right and wrong, who we are and what we stand for. If I knocked on this farmer's door, there's a pretty high chance that our values would differ on many, many levels. But I can almost guarantee that we could find some common ground, and that's where the magic happens. Farmers and rewilders share common ground. Both want a healthy environment and thriving rural communities. So the meeting point between the two tribes is actually much closer than we might imagine. And the same should be true or could be true of hunters. If habitats are rich in life, they have a greater ability to produce a sustainable harvest for hunting. So why aren't hunters and anglers passionate advocates for rewilding? And again, I think it comes down to values, things like tribal loyalty, safety in numbers, fitting in. These are all mechanisms that are built into our DNA. They're the sort of things that have kept us alive for millennia. In some circles, being visibly anti-rewilding is almost like a badge of honor. It's a badge of group membership. So again, we've got to get past this. The conclusion from all of this is that winning hearts and minds, it isn't easy and it isn't quick. But it's a journey that certainly Scotland, the big picture, believes is absolutely necessary. And as rewilders, we need to better equip ourselves to travel that journey. Despite the barriers, rewilding is happening. I'm sure today you'll hear many inspiring stories of rewilding happening. We see growing numbers of examples that show us what is possible. River restoration is one such example where finding common ground is really bearing fruit. Up and down the country, different people from different sectors are coming together for different reasons to restore whole river catchments, benefiting nature, climate, and people. And even previously tense, fractious conversations around the reintroduction of lynx, for example, are just starting to soften. They're starting to loosen. And that's fed by improved knowledge, improved awareness, and perhaps a collective societal responsibility to play our part in arresting and reversing global nature loss. But let's not forget that rewilding does represent change, and its relative newness still attracts suspicion and fear in some cases from those who are unaware of what that change might bring about. So I'm going to just leave you, if you don't mind, with two very humble requests. And the first is to take some time to learn about people. What makes them tick? What are their motivations and priorities in life? What are their values and belief systems? This knowledge will allow us all to better navigate resistance to change and therefore accelerate rewilding. And secondly, take some time to consider how the media influences our choices and decision making. Right here, right now, our media seems addicted to headline grabbing hysteria, which fuels division and conflict. So if you have any influence or connection with the media, it would be great to see more positive media stories that accurately demonstrate how rewilding looks and works and the opportunities that it can deliver. A couple of years ago, we published this report, Hearts and Minds, which delves a little bit deeper into this complex world of hearts and minds. So if you're interested, you can download a copy from our website. We still have a few printed copies left, I think, but all the information is on our website, which is here. If you'd like to join our journey, we'd be delighted to have you along. Lots of information here and also across the social media channels, as you might expect. So thank you very much indeed for listening. I hope you have a great day. I'm up here in the Cairngorm, so I couldn't be with you today, even if we were meeting physically. It's a long way to come. But anyway, I hope you have a great day, and all the best. Thank you very much indeed.
Hello, my name is Richard Durrant. I'm a touring musician, recording artist, composer, and I suppose a part-time activist. To be kinder to the environment and to create extra ways to talk about climate change, I cycle many of my concert tours. In recent years, I've pedalled around 7,000 miles, crisscrossing the British Isles, carrying my solo show in my panniers with my guitar and ukulele strapped to my trailer. If you'd like to see me live in the northeast, then the closest I'll get this year will be Dundee, Alnwick and York. That's all by car, by the way, but I will be pedalling past in the summer of 2025. I live in Sussex on the estuary of the River Adur. I'm an occasional all-year-round swimmer, which down here on the south coast really does mean occasional, because the seas on the south coast are, of course, normally full of raw sewage. I have links to Knepp, which is upstream from where I live, and I've released several pieces of music which follow a natural theme to express my love and concern for the natural world. Amongst the works of mine that can be heard variously, either on vinyl or streaming, are Stringhenge, Rewilding, Kenneth the Hedge, and most recently Bark and Tweet, and I'll actually be telling the story of Bark and Tweet later today. I'm really pleased to have been invited along today, and I'll be listening with interest as well as loitering about to answer any questions you may have, musical, bicycle or otherwise. Hi everybody, it's me again. Here is the story of my latest musical release, Bark and Tweet, which of course you can hear on Spotify. The truth is, the recording almost didn't happen. We needed a nightingale and none turned up. I played for a while and there was silence. My instrument felt alone. Then we did hear another voice, a nightingale, then another, and then another, eventually five nightingales and a ukulele and J.S. Bach. And yet again the magnetism of a rewilded area worked its magic. Here's how we did it. It was a moonlit April evening and I was out on the Sussex Weald where there wasn't a breath of wind. It was already past 10 o'clock and it felt chilly. I was walking along a track with my wife Louise, who was carrying a mic stand. I was carrying a very precious ukulele and we were looking for our friends Penny and Dave, whom we had arranged to meet near a junction of paths somewhere out on the Knepp estate. And in the stillness, under a full moon, we easily found each other. My friend Penny knows Knepp like no other, so she led us purposefully across a couple of fields and through a small copse. The four of us needed to find a good spot to set up. Penny knew best, she always does in these situations, so she led us to a little meadow where I took out my uke and began to tune quietly and carefully. Dave was fiddling with his camera and Louise and Penny were checking the field recorder, making sure that it was set to its highest resolution. I held my breath at the thought of what we were about to try. We needed silence, and for this we needed luck. In the distance, a lonely car swooped quietly along the tarmac of the A24, and the last EasyJet to Gatwick rumbled along the horizon. Finally, we stood in a near silence, witnessing the beauty of where we were. I flexed my fingers, ready to cut the air. My notes would drift out into space, a voice plucked from the wilderness. The sound of J.S. Bach, the simple timbre of a ukulele. So, here is what we recorded. 3 minutes and 14 seconds. Roll tape.
Hello, I'm Libby Drew. I'm the director of the NEP Wildland Foundation. Now, many of you will know NEP, of course, as one of the largest rewilding sites in lowland Britain. But I get to head up a really exciting new element of that, and that's the Wildland Foundation, an independent charitable organisation that was set up to use the lessons and the principles of NEP, but catalyse nature recovery right across Sussex and beyond, with a real focus on the next generation of rewilders. We've also got an interest in data and insights and opening up the 20 odd years of knowledge and data that's been collected at NEP, just to make sure it's useful and usable for other audiences. But for those who want a brief introduction to NEP, this is what it looks like from the sky. And it's obviously such a beautiful vista, but 21 years ago, this was a heavily farmed landscape. It was arable and dairy, and though you can't see it, underneath that lovely green coverage is very thick, claggy, sticky Wealden clay. Very, very difficult to farm that kind of landscape, as indeed Charlie Burrell and Isabella Tree found out when they took on the farm. The margins for farming can be very narrow anyway, but it just wasn't working. And as the costs of farming increased over the years, it became impossible to keep NEP going as a farm. At that moment where it became despairing, Charlie and Izzy had the benefit of connecting with some really radical thinkers in the European conservation movement. And they suggested that if it's not able to produce calories, NEP might be able to produce something else of great worth, which was the nature benefit. And therefore, they started to experiment with the concept of what we now know as rewilding. And it really is an extraordinary story, and many of you will have read Izzy's book, but it wasn't just the vegetation that you can see, which we loosely term sort of scrubland. It's thick, thorny bushes and small trees like hawthorn, blackthorn, and dog rose, and of course willow and all of those lovely billowing hedges that you can see. But we needed something to disrupt it, otherwise it would become closed canopy, which is dark and quite poor for biodiversity. So introducing our large herbivores, which are wonderful and charismatic parts of NEP. This is the wild horse, of course, the longhorn cow. We've got our Tamworth standing in for the wild boar, and we've got our red deer along with fallow and roe. So these engineers, these browsers and tramplers and nibblers and dung producers shape the landscape. They prevent it from returning to closed canopy. And they also bring in wonderful visitors who want to see these animals as they may have been years and years ago before agriculture changed the shape of our landscape. Now, when I arrived 2 years ago, somebody else quite exciting arrived, and that's, of course, the beaver. We've lost beavers from Britain, and our waterways are suffering terribly as a result. So we have beavers now. Sadly, they have to remain in an enclosure for now, whilst we grapple with the policy around these wonderful watery engineers. But they are turning NEP's kind of very small headwaters. So we sit on the headwaters of the River Ada. They're turning these little trickles of streams and tributaries into this absolutely extraordinary wetland, which even in the height of drought was deep water, full of biodiversity, and they're just extraordinary as well. So this is NEP, but actually my job and the job of my team largely sits outside of the edges of the estate. And that's because when I came in, I was asked to oversee this extraordinary project called Wheel to Waves. So Wheel to Waves is essentially a wildlife corridor. The wildlife corridors that we might conjure up in our imagination are kind of large sort of landscape scale pieces connecting national parks. You might think of kind of bison roaming through Canada or the US, and that kind of Yellowstone to Yukon National Park framework. And indeed, around the world, there are extraordinary corridors. But what about the UK? We've lost that idea that we have species flowing alongside our human landscape. And yet the idea of corridors came back into frame with the Making Space for Nature report. Sir John Lawson reminded us that our wildlife sites are just too small and too fragmented. And not only is that going to get worse with climate change and an increasing human landscape, but it's terrible news, not just for wildlife, but for all the ecosystem services it's trying to provide us as humans. As we're fragmenting our landscape, we're breaking down those services. And we know that with our waterways, we know that with our air pollution, our plummeting soil health. So he called for bigger, better, more joined up. And that has become such a refrain for, I was going to say the conservation movement, but I think beyond that, this idea that our future depends on connectivity and of having these better, higher quality sites. So here you can see the diagram of kind of how that works. You've got these stepping stones. These are our little sites at the moment that provide kind of reprieve across the landscapes, but you've got core areas like NEP and other reserves. We also need the noodles in between, the linear corridors, as well as those larger landscape corridors. But what's stopping that from happening? Well, if you think about the land use in the UK, it actually does sometimes kind of wake us up to the realities of what we're dealing here. The majority of the UK is farmed. We actually have a relatively small amount that has housing on it, just less than 6%. And that's not just housing, that's all of our industry and all of our road and rail. For someone who was born in Oxford Street, that's me, I thought the entire world was paved. I found that stat extraordinary when I realized actually how little is paved and built on. And when we go into Sussex, that picture just becomes even more extreme. We've got at least 72%, sometimes even higher, that statistic, of farmed landscape in Sussex. And we have a slightly higher housing burden as well. So when we talk about corridors and we talk about land use, we are fundamentally talking about a farmer-led movement. And that changes so much because that movement for green transition, that movement for nature and biodiversity has not been led by the farmers. And indeed, it has not even included the farming community until very recently. And that should wake us up to the fact that we need to start to not build just bridges between our landscapes, but between these productive sectors in the UK. But why does that not happen? Well, it doesn't happen for so many reasons. But, you know, you hear this incredibly binary position peddled really by some of our leaders, but largely by sensational media, that says, oh, we can't eat trees or butterflies and there isn't space for food in nature. We cannot and do not accept that there is a choice between food and nature when the two are intertwined and the two lead to one another. And yet somehow we've been kind of almost tricked into a false dichotomy. Farmers have always been the providers of multiple natural services. So going right back to the beginning of agriculture, calories and food, productive food was such a drive, but at the same time, there was access to green space for all of the population. There was flood management. There was the restoration of soils, that organic matter going back in, biodiversity, of course, havens in our farmland. So many of our creatures, our species have evolved around farming. They would have planted their hedgerows and the trees. So this idea that it's new, that farmers now need to be honoured and respected and paid for multiple services, it is a fallacy. They have always been providing this. And indeed, those shocks that we had during the Second World War and other times where farmland has had to double down on their calories, that has left the scar. It isn't that we're now asking for something new, but we're recognising something that's always been there. But the challenges are multiple. This concept of moving into ecosystem services is fraught with uncertainty, and it's coming at a time when farmers are really facing huge costs in producing food. We've had, of course, one of the wettest winters on record, drought as well, no doubt to come. We've got this really very real and important concept that we have heritage landscapes that are shaped by our hedgerows, our dry stone walls, our green pastures. And of course, we lack the regional frameworks, that hyper-local leadership to stop this directive coming from Parliament to, say, Northumberland or to Wales. We've got to have that locally led framework. Information and communication, is so much of this comes down to semantics and also the inability to share information well with our land managing community and to listen carefully to them. And we have an aging farming population. What's going to happen in the next 20 years when our farmers, who are on average just over 60, have to hand over to someone? And finally, tenancy. We have a really long history of tenancy farming, particularly places like the North are heavily managed by tenant farms. Where is the mindset that is allowing them to get behind or benefit from these longer agricultural and green transition? So farming at the centre, here is one of the farmers I work with most closely. It's James Baird, who farms down in West Sussex, not far from Net, but he farms on the coast, one of the last undeveloped coastal farms. You can see it just in the picture there. And he is right at the forefront of this because he and the EA have been in loggerheads for a number of years. The Environment Agency has run out of money to protect Climping Gap from the sea. The sea level rises, the shock of these increasing storms, and he has fought them because he's losing arable land every single year. But what he has come to realize is that there's something more valuable that that land can provide: salt marsh and the riparian land of the Ada as he sits at the mouth. And indeed, as he's been coming to the realization of what was here, there's starting to be discussions about how payments might be given to farmers to be able to support the return of these habitats. But this is all happening right on the fly. And he says there is no emergency service for the nature crisis. And if there's anything, it's us, the farmers, and we are like paramedics without first aid training. So such an important reminder that people want to do it, but they don't know how, or they don't even know what the outcome is meant to be. And they certainly don't know how to balance it with their farm businesses. But he was given a copy of Isabel's book, so he read about her ambition to connect Net up to other sites, and he and Izzy and Charlie rallied as many of the larger farmers and land managers and estates across Sussex as they could. And here they are meeting in lockdown when you were allowed those outdoor gatherings. And I love this photo. Everyone's so hopeful. And of course, you know, Rewilding and Hope, this wasn't all about rewilding, but it was about wild space and our wildlife, and this idea that they would come together to connect the landscape. And they had 3 goals. They wanted to create a nationally significant wildlife corridor. It was going to, if it was going to take in all their sites, have to be 100 miles long, taking in roughly 20,000 hectares of largely contiguous land. Now that's the really ambitious bit, largely contiguous. So this is really talking about joined up, not just the stepping stones. They wanted to try and kind of wake people up to the fact that this wasn't altruistic. This was about the provision of services. And they wanted to bring people with them. That horrendous sense that rewilding or nature recovery needs to depopulate, that could not and would not be the case. We would bring people across Sussex with us. And so this corridor landed in my lap in May 2022. And I thought, what a radical and wonderful project. And then once I got over that, we realized what an extraordinarily complex thing to actually do. So we set about, and it took us a year to do this, thinking about the route between those sites. And some of the data sets we had to look at were species focused. So we had the wonderful bug life bee lines. So here they are, those kind of wiggly pollinating intestines that sit alongside everything we do. And this is how our butterflies and our hoverflies and our bees travel. We could overlay the rivers, our natural corridors, our tributaries and waterways. And then we started looking at our protected areas. You've got the South Downs National Park there, the area of outstanding natural beauty, and you've got these wonderful kind of sites of wildlife opportunity, triple SIs and so on. And it gave us this shamanic thing, which we called our vision map. And it's a wonderful illustration of what might be, what could be, and it gives us permission to hope. Now, this is the hardest working map in Southeast England we have taken it around pubs and playgrounds and council parish meetings, and it's on my fridge covered in sticky jam fingers from my kids. But it is something that can excite a 10-year-old and a seasoned politician. And you'll see at the top, Ashdown Forest forms the top most northerly corner. And at the bottom, you have something extraordinary, the kelp forest restoration. And now what we had to do was georeference that lovely map. So we had to start making it boring again. And here you have two colors. The teal is a 1 kilometer wide monitoring and evaluation zone. So that is where we really want to know how species is flowing and where we're looking at that kind of structural connectivity. So replacing habitats. The radiant zone, which James Baird termed the radiant zone, I love that, is community engagement and also farmer engagement. So everything that happens in that golden area affects that teal zone. And so we can bring with us, in this sense, 250,000 people into this project. Of course, after doing the nice bit of what is possible, we had to start to overlay the fragmentation. And here you've got the roads and the built up areas cutting up the corridor. But there's also other forms of fragmentation, like light pollution. These are the areas where bats and moths and glowworm and others that rely on our dark skies really struggle. And then the noise pollution of roads. It's not just the hard landscaping, but that sheer roar that can scramble the sensitive species. So important to remind everyone that this isn't just about what we understand as rewilding, that idea of full ecosystem health. It cannot be. If you think about that landscape that we just looked at, it is commuters, it's got housing burden, it has our schools, it's got our farmland in such a high percentage. And indeed, we do have a food security challenge. It may not be as dramatic or binary, but it's very real. And we also want to be producing food in our landscape, local food for our local population. So this is about marginal land. This is about land that's got very little agricultural or even development value. And there's plenty of that. This is about compromised land, land that sits alongside the river that's under floodwater, brackish water, so much of the year. We need our bigger, better, as well as our more joined up. So we've got our NEPs, our nature reserves as well. And then in between all that amazing connective tissue that is our hedgerows and our verges, or up here in the north, our dry stone walls that we see. So that's already in existence. And it's about bringing to light how our species are using it and then trying to enhance that. And one of the big questions is, why would all these farmers with their thin margins and all of those challenges and that uncertainty, why would they come to the table to be part of something that would traditionally have been led by the conservation movement? And that's because we are changing the way that we think about public money for public good. And of course, that's come since we've left the EU, and we've started to be able to develop our own environmental land management scheme. And it's not perfect by far. It has a long journey to do, but it is quite interesting and radical in the way that it's thinking about the landscape as a provider of services. So we've got carbon, biodiversity, being able to hold nutrients and ensure that they aren't going into our waterways, hold and provide water, make sure that that natural flood management's happening. And other things like providing space for people struggling with health or chronic pain. So really wonderful. And each of these blocks has a business plan associated with it, and buyers and financiers who are interested in backing it. What an extraordinary era to be working in, where nature is being built back into our economy. And as a result, we are starting to see collaboration on a global, but certainly in the UK, national scale. So when a farmer joins up or expresses an interest, we ask them to sign a pledge, and it's beautiful. It pledges all the right things about putting nature back at the forefront of our thinking and our planning. But beyond that, it had to go that little bit further. It could not just sit as an aspiration. So in comes our brilliant technology to save the day. And this is where we start to use GIS mapping. In this instance, it's our partner Land app, which some of you may have used or know about, but is a brilliant bridge between the farming world and these incredibly important nature outcomes. So you can go in, you can put your postcode in, or if you're a farmer, your SBI number, and you can import your field data. You can then play around with different layers to see what habitats are there. You can put your own knowledge in, so ground truthing it. And it can go as far as to help you develop an environmental land management plan, or just host that if you've already done that work. You can also signpost farmers to different schemes that they might be eligible for. And then they can then share that with Wheel to Waves as a publisher. And in doing so, they give us the permission to share that data with you. And that means that they are on the map. We're increasingly, as we develop the site, with those plans visible. Now, that's a really wonderful place to go and find out what's happening in the corridor, but it also allows us to measure what we're meant to be looking at. So here are the biggest land blocks that you can see. These are substantial farms and estates. You can see Knepp there, just below Horsham. You've got the Whiston estate as well. And Climping, you can see by Bognor Regis, that's James Baird's. And all the way up at the top there, you've got Ashdown Forest. When you go in, you can have a look at these sites, and they can add their own photographs. So here's Sompting Estate on the Upper Ada, and that's wonderful because you can see the dew ponds and you can read a bit more about them. I was going to show you about this. So there we go. So one of the ways that we're trying to speak to everyone at scale, because you can imagine there's over 400 farms in the corridor, is working through this idea of farmer clusters. So farmers are now collaborating at local level, sometimes 20 to 30, even 40 farms, all managed by a centrally funded facilitator. So that gives us an opportunity to go and speak to those facilitators about what farms are doing, what estates are hoping to achieve. And we can then start to work with those facilitators to get everyone mapped on. And that just gives us that level of efficiency. It's not all about farms. And the wonderful thing about the Sussex landscape is 10% of it is gardens and green spaces. So if you think about all that work we're doing with farms, we wanted to be able to apply the same rigor to the gardens and green spaces that sit on the landscape, because actually at 10% of the landscape, they are the largest land managing block. And that's pretty radical. I think Ashdown's the next biggest with 7% of the Sussex landscape. But think about the power of gardens and green spaces. Think about what they could do if they are the largest landowning block, and if only they were working in tandem on the same principles of connectivity. They wouldn't just provide stepping stones, they would actually provide elements of the corridor in their own right. So we asked everybody to do the same thing, to go online and to join us. Put in your postcode, just like a farm can, and you can find out if you're in or out the corridor in the radiant zone. We accept pledges from all across Sussex because we want to know what's happening outside of the corridor too. And then here you are. Here are all the gardens and green spaces. So we currently got about 600 gardens, allotments, council-led verges and village greens, and they all appear little dots like a kind of honeybee or swarm. And those are appearing every time we put out communication. And we ask them to do very simple things. Think about connectivity between hard borders, think about the pollinator highways, and think about water. It could be as small as a little trug pond, but putting those stepping stones back in. And we asked you to baseline your gardens. So people have been going out there, taking before and after photographs. They're also built, we've got bio boxes that are going into parish councils, which you can borrow, and you can actually look at your soil, if you've got water, your water health, your air quality and noise pollution, and you can then monitor that and submit that. So really rigorous science data for our gardens, treating them as if they were chalk, floodplain, clay, wonderful kind of landscape view of our projects. If you don't own land, we still want you. If you don't even have access to a garden or a window box, we still want you in the corridor, because the fabric of the corridor is made up by that really amazing 250,000 people who work and live there. So we've got 163 parish blocks. Now, parish councils are a much sort of overlooked champions, I think, in the landscape. They have a very important role in green spaces. They have a say in planning, and they're wonderful kind of volunteer hubs. So when we were thinking about breaking up the corridor into kind of manageable community engagement chunks, they felt like the right mix. And indeed, we had 220 parish councillors there to launch the corridor back in summer 2022. So they've remained this very important part of the project. We've got some who are so engaged that they're community champions, so they are really shaping the project. But we've also got observers, recorders, and lots of schools. And we're asking people to go out and survey their areas, so through their footpaths or with permission on council or farmer land. And they take an hour every week, and they'll look at maybe 1 kilometre of their landscape. And in that way, we hope that this will become one of the largest research transects, so that linear path in the country, really driven by this amazing kind of group of people, some of whom are training, others who will simply be learning with us. And finally, 2 points that I felt were important to bring in is we can't just go out and monitor what's there, because we're missing so much. We've lost so many of our native species from the landscape. So part of the corridor, and indeed the foundation and NEP's work, is about species recovery. Some of the species you see here are already back. They're already home in Sussex. So our kelp forest, which is one of the most ancient forests in Sussex. And I love the fact that the corridor connects the Ashdown forest, one ancient forest, with the kelp forest under the sea. That is returning. Amazing work done on both policy level and the practical habitat creation. We are seeing that return. The white-tailed eagle, brilliant work again done to reintroduce those to the Isle of Wight, are now back in the corridor, and extraordinary to see those flying over our motorways and our IA roads. We know we've got our eels, for example, but they're really woefully kind of declining. And then you'll see the white stork. Many of you will come to NEP and see the wonderful, and talk about rewilding and hope, extraordinary birds back in our landscape, and a beaver, of course, there. But we are missing species like the pine marten, like the redback shrike, our butcher bird there, which was so iconic, and a water vole missing from NEP still, and certainly across the corridor. And then even the tiniest little things, the black vein white, a small, almost sort of overlooked butterfly, but was vanished from our landscape. And with just a little bit of help, we can return these species, some of which are engineers and some are simply iconic. And the other bit alongside species recovery has to be our water. And the river recovery I particularly end on, because it holds a special place for us as the foundation, because we are lucky enough to be leading one of the government-led pilots for water recovery. So Landscape Recovery launched last year, and we brought together a project called the Ada River Recovery. This is where NEP sits at the headwaters of the Ada. And in an extraordinary demonstration of collaboration, we've brought together 27 farmers and a group of conservation partners. And you can see some of them standing there. Now, these are farmers that have never worked together before. Many of them won't even go to the pub together because they hold such opposing views, but they are here pledging proportions of their riverside farm to nature recovery. Again, to keep in your mind those challenges, they're doing it because it's compromised. Lots of it is under floodwater, it is floodplain. And because their farm margins, their profit margins are really struggling, and they may well be able to provide a service that is of value and a financial benefit to them. So that might look like remeandering the river through its old floodplain paths, holding floodwater, putting back trees and scrubs so we've got those shady, cooling the river again. So much of that heat is affecting the species in the summer months. Collecting rainfall for rainwater harvest. And also then, of course, down at the intertidal and down at the mouth, that's salt marsh and mudflat creation, as well as floodplain meadows. So a whole host of options for them to decide upon. And this is just to remind us that this is what it looks like. If you think 100 miles of largely contiguous habitat creation through Sussex sounds like pie in the sky, well, we're doing it right now. This is happening right now. We're bang in the middle of the 2-year pilot, and it is going so well, and we have such a fantastic buy-in from those farmers who are taking real risks and thinking about not just the habitat, but how legally is that protected? Who's paying for it? Who will buy those services? And this time next year, we will have all those answers and be able to supply a blueprint, not just for Sussex, but for water recovery across the country. So to finish, and that's a whistle-stop tour of how landscape connectivity is working, but it is always going to be a mix. And keep this in mind in this volatile moment as we go into election period. Water particularly, but environment and net zero are going to be key bargaining chips, and we are going to be asked to choose. We do not have to choose. And no matter who you talk to, the strategists, whether it's looking at food, water, carbon, they are saying the same. It has to be a mix of everything. We need some farmland to be repurposed. Places like NEP that were unproductive are perfect. And those will go into wholesale into environmental benefit. Some of our farms will need to be farmed at lower yields, and that's in order to bring back nature onto those land holdings. And indeed, wouldn't it be wonderful if there was a premium on that produce? So we knew when we went to the shops that we didn't just have to donate to conservations, but we could buy this produce that were farmed alongside nature. And indeed, we're seeing some of that in our supermarkets. But we're also going to need our higher yielding farms. We're going to need our super food producing farms, and that's going to require low carbon, high technology, and a real cry to our younger generation who are leaving the farming community to return with their wonderful, indestructible, innovative mindsets and reapply all their learning from higher education to the farm, so that we can get that productivity, as the food strategy says, as Dimbleby says, without polluting the earth. And if we do it, well, green and pleasant land may become even more pleasant. We may find that we can have our nature reserves reappearing in smaller but incredibly strategic stepping stones. We'll find that we can join those up, working with councils, farmers, to take proportions of that land into those linear landscape corridors. We work as we are with our national infrastructure, our highways and our railways, to be able to put green bridges back. We're really behind in Britain, but you go across the channel and they're going up 10, 20, 30 a year. We will find a way to bring the farmers who want to return to more traditional farming techniques, very much looking at the new emphasis on soil, to put back cover crops, to put back soil nutrition into our soil. And of course, our waterways will start to return. Projects like the Ada River recovery, going into these new eras, and not just providing the wetland, but holding back floodwater so the most productive farmland down in the lower catchment can continue to produce food. And there we'll see our species return. We know from NEP that nature wants to bounce back, and it can do so really quickly in our lifetimes. So have hope, because there is strategies and frameworks, there are technologies that can help, but more importantly, there is a new era of collaboration that we never thought was possible. And landscapes like this are truly only right round the corner.
Hello and welcome to the Wilder Northumberland Network. My name is Graham Holohug and I am the Wilder Northumberland Development Officer for Northumberland Wildlife Trust, and we host the network. First job is to thank our funders, the Rees Foundation, who are funding the network and have been key to the purchase of Northumberland Wildlife Trust flagship wilding site, West Chevington, which I'll talk about briefly later. So what is the Wilder Northumberland Network? It is an exciting new network for nature recovery in Northumberland. The network seeks to connect land managers who are currently or would like to undertake nature recovery actions, including wilding. The Wilder Northumberland Network endeavours to increase connectivity across Northumberland, removing barriers to species movement while also creating more space for water and more space for trees and scrub. The network aims to inspire people, provide access to key resources and peer learning opportunities, offer expert advice and share local and national experiences. We launched the network in March this year. So why do we need a network? I am sure that you all realise the state of nature and urgency of doing something about the biodiversity crisis. I think the following visuals are a sobering reminder. So not a great picture, but in the last few years, some encouragement with beaver and watervole reintroduction projects, pine martins crossing the border into areas of Northumberland. Fittingly, we had the sighting of a golden eagle over us during our launched field trip to Whiteley Moor, the first Northumberland sighting of golden eagle from many of the attendees. Why a nature recovery network? So for us, DEFRA actually hit on the head with their description of the nature recovery network. Create and restore wildlife-rich habitats, corridors and stepping stones that help wildlife populations to recover, grow, move, thrive and adapt to a changing climate. So why not a rewilding network? Rewilding to be most effective works at scale. Not everyone can work at the scale required. So rewilding to us is part of the toolkit of nature recovery. It can create focus points, but we also need to provide those stepping stones and corridors. We have projects in the network that are working at 6,000 hectares, but we also want to work on farms and smaller land holdings that can provide those wildlife-rich stepping stones and corridors. The farm landscape can play its part, whether it's providing corridors alongside food production, or turning over part of the farm to species-rich meadows or woodland, which in some cases can aid profitability. So what are the barriers to nature recovery? There are those who don't believe in the biodiversity or climate crisis. But for those that do and have land that they can undertake nature recovery on, there are three main reasons why people don't start. Lack of ecological knowledge, social stigma, being out of step with neighbours, financial barrier, thinking they can't afford it, but also they don't know where to start. We can help advise on the ecological side. Peer support can come from the network and help with funding or examples or others that made it work for themselves. At the very least, we can be the first person to chat through their ideas with. There are a lot of existing networks and farmland advisors out there, and it can be overwhelming. 70 people are part of the Northumberland Farm Advisor Forum. And then there are a series of networks that focus on different topics and all support in their own way. So where do you start and who do you talk to? Our chief exec, Mike Pratt, said at the Wilding Networks North Conference last year. So I also think we need to think about designing and setting up a Northern Wilding Intelligence Hub so we can share information and experience much more effectively. So we learned from other networks, talked to key projects in the area, and this is what we set up. One of our key aims is to make sure that members know who to talk to, and we can signpost and connect them to the right people that can help with their needs. Much of the network is about peer learning. There's a lot of knowledge out there, and we will hold events and site visits to help people share and gain knowledge from each other. We have our first site visit in a few weeks at our West Chevington, and future trips to other network members are in planning. We have just had a talk about connecting landscapes and how food production and nature can work together. In July, we're going to celebrate North Bogfest with an event at one of our network members, Moss Petrol, looking at all things peat. As well as providing peer support, we're going to offer wilder resources. Up-to-date funding opportunities can help network members decide which is the best for their needs. We often get asked, who should I get to do this? We have started the contractor list where members can add their own recommendations to. As well as wilder resources, we can offer wilder services. We can provide ecological advice, and Northumberland Wildlife Trust has over 200 registered volunteers which we can use to help on practical tasks. FlexiGraze is a conservation grazing community interest company that matches livestock owners with landowners needed grazing. We can also advise and help out with surveys and monitoring on members' sites. Starting off maybe with soundscapes, where we can provide the equipment and do the analysis at a lot lower cost of each member doing it on their own site. During the time that we spent planning the network, we met with many of the large nature recovery projects in Northumberland. We talked about their needs to the network, and three key topics came up every time. Grazing. At what levels? Where to get livestock? No fence collars or fencing. Monitoring. Everyone has their own protocols for baselining, monitoring and surveying. Many projects also wanted advice and contacts for unfamiliar areas of study. There was a desire for monitoring to have some level of standardization, but with the need for site-specific methods too. And how can we make the data more powerful? And then how to finance. the pros and cons and agri-environment schemes, private finance, B&G and much more. There was also a desire for learning from the larger projects to be taken down to smaller projects who may not have the expertise in their fields themselves. Could we help them find cows? Could we devise monitoring schemes that work and are achievable on a small scale? Can we help them finance their projects? But what else can it do? As I said, we only launched in March this year. We have ideas on how the network become more beneficial for its members and nature recovery, and we'll be constantly evolving to meet those needs. I have already mentioned the monitoring equipment loan scheme, but we can also help roll out species projects, whether it's water voles, beavers, pine martens. We can bring together landowners for landscape scale funding, help students and early career professionals. We've also talked about tree nurseries. So to become a member, you need to own or manage land, over 5 hectares or 1 kilometre corridor that you are or want to manage for nature recovery. And you need to meet some of our principles. Making space for water, whether that's re-wetting, slowing the flow, re-wiggling the streams and rivers, floodplain management, or beavers. Making space for trees and scrub through wilder hedgerows, natural regeneration, native planting, encouraging scrub or leaving deadwood. Letting nature lead through the principles of diminishing management, naturalised grazing, habitat succession, and using proxy herbivores. Increasing connectivity by working in river corridors, repairing woodland, uncut verges, wilder field margins, and moving barriers to movement of species. The network launched in March of this year and currently has over 24,000 hectares of land signed up. Our members include all the large nature recovery projects that are happening in Northumberland, 3 of the Wildlife Trust reserves alongside farms and private landholdings. In the last couple of weeks, we have had 4 sites that have contacted us and keen to join the network, and we'll be adding these to the network when we have had our initial site visits. And now to look in more detail at some of our members. West Chevington consists of 327 hectares of former overcast, now a mosaic of woodland, grassland and lower quality arable land with a system of ponds, ditches and streams. There are 2 arable farm businesses on site as well as the Northsteads Wind Farm. This ambitious project aims to change land management approaches to kickstart natural processes, store more carbon, restore biodiversity and connect wildlife habitats at the local scale. This will be done through a combination of natural regeneration of woodlands and other habitats, the introduction of low levels of grazing animals and some habitat restoration. Northumberland Wildlife Trust has 2 more sites in the network, Benshaw and Whiteley Moor. Whiteley Moor National Nature Reserve has been grazed for hundreds of years. At the start of 2024, the sheep were removed from the site to allow scrub to develop further across the reserve. Erston Hill Farm, an intensive arable farm for 45 years. With yields and fertility dropping, they entered the mid-tier stewardship scheme to produce organic, traditional, flower-rich hay meadows. They have restored over 4.5 miles of hedgerow and planted 5 hectares of native woodland. Erston Hill Farm sits just across the road from our Northumberland Wildlife Trust's newly acquired West Forest site, and is not far from Fenlet Rewilding, and then on to Welding West Chevington, and a couple of fields further on is Northumberland Wildlife Trust Reserve at East Chevington. East Chevington sits on the coast, which already has a near continuous network of sites belonging to the Wildlife Trust, Northumberland County Council and the National Trust. The network is keen to work with the landowners in between network sites to create a continuous wildlife corridor. College Valley. College Valley Estates is one of our largest members. They are working on a 100-year vision and action plan to increase biodiversity and bioabundance over the whole 13,000 acres of the estate. The directors wish to maximise the estate's value in terms of ecology and community through a mosaic of different land uses. Their utopian vision for College Valley is for it to be a place of outstanding natural beauty, featuring meadows and streams in the valley floor, merging into mixed open canopy native woodlands and pastures, and, as you climb, merging into open moorland with heaths and bogs. The estate sits in our monitoring and finance focus groups. Fenlet Rewilding. When an area of restored open cast came up for sale next to their house, Jill and David jumped at the chance to buy it. The 135 acres comprises 6 acres of poor quality arable fields and 75 acres of recently planted native trees along the banks of a small stream and 3 ponds. The arable fields have been allowed to stand uncultivated for the last 5 years, and they are looking to increase biodiversity in these areas. The network is working with Jill and David to look at the opportunities to make the most of their land through advice, contacts to funders, as well as linking them up with the Wilding West Chevington project, which is just down the road. So finally, do keep in touch. If you have or know someone with land in Northumberland that may be interested in the network, please encourage them to get in touch via our website or email. We're on Facebook, Instagram and X, and post on Northumberland Wildlife Trust LinkedIn. Thanks to everyone for listening and Sharon and the team for hosting.
So hi everybody, I'm Jenny Barlow. I'm the Reserve Manager for the Tarras Valley, and I work as part of the team at the Langham Initiative, who are a long-standing community development trust based in Langham, who led the rollercoaster of a journey that we've been on over the last 3 years to bring 10,500 acres of the Tarras Valley into community ownership. So Langham and the Tarras Valley are now the largest community land buyout in the south of Scotland. So I'm really excited to be here to tell you more about our story. So just a little bit of background on Langham for those of you who have never been. So Langham is based, it nestled in the hills of Dumfries and Galloway. It's an incredible community of about 2,300 people with so much spirit and heart. We've got loads of facilities that are community run, including childcare, the paper, the day centre, arts centre, the local library. And Langham's people have very deep cultural connections with their land. So common riding has been happening for 270 years, where the community have marked the common boundaries of the land surrounding the town every year in what is now an absolutely huge celebration of land rights and culture. And Langham hasn't been without its difficulties. There's been a lot of economic decline with the traditional textile industries, which the town was famous. So that's meant large job losses, people moving out, loss of those traditional skills, and less economic opportunity for the young people who want to stay here. So community ownership of land and a land buyout of this size was a chance to help support all the amazing ongoing regeneration efforts in the town, but also most importantly was to help open up new opportunities for people through the creation of a landscape scale nature reserve. So it's by far not the silver bullet, and it won't solve all of Langham's problems, but it's a really powerful tool. And land is a huge part of the culture and the identity of Langham. So it's really hugely powerful symbol that after centuries of being marked by its people to keep their rights over it, that it now largely sits in community ownership, and the future's there for the shaping by the community. So how do we get to be South of Scotland's largest community landowner? So in 2019, there was an announcement by Buccleuch Estates that the Langham Moor and Tarras Valley were being put up for sale by the estate. And that was the catalyst that began this whole journey. There had not been an aspiration to be a community landowner before this happened. But it was a sort of reactive but very necessary move to start to look at it. So there was a huge amount of fear about the future. What does the future hold with this really precious land going up for sale? Many didn't want to let the opportunity pass by. So the Langham Initiative took forward a huge community engagement exercise to see if people actually wanted us to pursue buying the land. And there was a resounding positive response that gave it the green light. Not everybody agreed, and some still don't. It's a huge change and a shift to what's gone before, with one person owning most of the land around the area for hundreds of years. And that's okay that people don't all agree. That's the nature of the community-led element, and not everybody will agree. And that's our responsibility as the Langham Initiative to help to facilitate discussions, help to find a way, find common ground, listen to each other, respect each other, and value that lived experience and what's gone before as we go forward. So there was a great deal of hard work to make sure this stacked up economically with the feasibility and business planning to ensure this was a viable and sustainable venture for the community. So in the last 3 years, there's been 2 epic land buyout fundraiser campaigns led by the Langham Initiative that have raised £6 million. They've attracted interest and support, not just locally, but from all over the world, that helped us to achieve what often felt like impossible odds to get here. People from all over the world heard our story and believed along with us and came together in the most incredible ways to help make this happen. And it just felt like, especially during the pandemic, when all this started, just a little spark of hope that came from the people that decided to do something and make a change just resonated with thousands of people. And I think that was because it was tangible and it was community and it was real people just taking on something that felt quite impossible at the time. And I can probably speak for the whole team when I say at the start and at regular points throughout the buyout, we could never have imagined that we'd be here having such an exciting and bright future ahead. And now we've secured the land. The buyout definitely feels like the easy bit. Then the hard work starts now to make all these aspirations a reality. So we're getting to grips with everything from project development, ongoing community engagement, day-to-day running, being a community landlord, managing everything from the sort of roads, our farm, properties, woodlands, water supplies, insurances. So we've got a lot on our hands as well as doing all the exciting nature restoration. It's daunting sometimes, but it's incredibly exciting. So what have we bought? Just to give you a very quick idea of the scale of it. So you can see Langham just here. So this land pretty much wraps sort of round the town and right up the catchment. So it's most of the River Tarras Valley catchment that's now sits in community ownership. So it's an incredibly rich resource right on the doorstep for us to develop going forward. So I'll cover a little bit about what we're doing now, the valleys in community ownership. So Tarras Valley Nature Reserve is so many different things to so many different people. It's a place for nature to thrive. It's a place for learning and discovery. It's a place to call home. It's a place to connect with the land. It's a place to connect with nature. It's a place for work. It's a place to visit, a place to celebrate and value culture and traditions. It's a place that we hope will support well-being, health and happiness. And it's a place we're adapting to our changing climate. So what is our job as community or custodians of the community land is that we have to balance all of these different interests, which is not easy sometimes, to create a world-class community asset. And what's really special is that this place is owned by the community in perpetuity. It's not just 5 years and we're done. It's long-term and for ecological restoration. That's exactly the timeline we need to be thinking of. It's not short-termism. So ultimately, it's about us creating a rich legacy for future and current generations. It's a forever project and it's community-owned. It's community-owned land as a resource and an asset for people in perpetuity. So just before I go on to a little bit more about our work, just why does it matter? I think this is a really important thing to cover because we always get asked, what was the point of you owning the land? Because of the community could always access it with Scotland's right to roam. That won't change if it's in community ownership or not. And that's true. The access won't change, but it's about so much more than that. It's about community having a means to meet local needs in really innovative ways. It's a means to shape future opportunities and having more autonomy on over the environment around us. Scotland still has one of the most concentrated land ownership patterns in Europe. So hopefully, along with what we're doing and alongside other community landowners across Scotland, we're really showing what's possible when communities have the chance to shape their own futures through democratic ownership of land and assets. And owning land for us comes with power and responsibility. So we're trying to use that in a positive way to start a new chapter of hope and bring new opportunities for people and do our bit as a community to help restore nature and respond to the climate emergency from a local level. So what does our community-led approach look like? So really importantly, people are at the heart of what we're doing. That's the reason why we were set up as a community development trust way back in 1994. As part of what we're doing, as the organisation, we're locally rooted and we're locally led. So our board and our trustees are all volunteers from the local area and our staff all live in the town. So we're really visible and we've been working very hard to build trust with the community on such a sort of a big change right on the doorstep. In what we do, we really try and put forward first and foremost that local voices, whether you agree or not, are heard and valued. And this isn't a sort of decide, announce and defend approach. It is actually genuinely listening and respecting and deciding the way forward together, valuing local lived experience and that human connection with the land, and that goes back a very, very long way, hundreds of years, as well as scientific evidence. And hopefully, as we develop the reserve, our work will mean that people have opportunities to come together and connect through the land, whether that's through volunteering sessions, community events, common riding, which will see thousands of people come to Langham every single year, workshops, coming on holiday here, adventuring, discovering your first insect, or just on a dog walk through the woods. So what underpins what we're doing, what we're trying to achieve? So we've got 4 key pillars that underpin our work to create the Tarras Valley Nature Reserve. Now it's in community ownership, and these have actually been pretty solid throughout. So we set these out at the beginning, and they've actually helped to keep the parameters really clear for us all the way through, a really clear purpose and mission as we develop things. So that's helped the team, especially when we've all come into place after the buyout, to sort of hit the ground running, when we haven't had too much creep of the scope in terms of what we're doing, which has been really, really good for us to keep getting things moving quickly. So people, the community is at the heart of our work. So that's about empowering and reconnecting people with the land and nature through a community-led approach. Nature, large-scale ecosystem restoration. Climate, doing our bit to create a fairer and brighter future, making a meaningful contribution to the climate and ecological emergencies. And sustainability, crucially, running responsibly. So we're here for the long haul. So how are we putting all this into practice? Something that we've been taking a lot of time to do since the land transferred over to us, the last tranche of land in 2022, is that we've been doing loads of community engagement across the town and with different partners to develop our 5-year action plan. It's taken us a bit longer than we thought because there was so much stuff to get through, but we've had some really good discussions, and actually having had the land a little while, it's made the plan a lot more meaningful. So that should be published very soon. But the whole point of that was just to revisit our sort of aspirations as part of the buyout, refresh our community mandate, get a big conversation going in terms of what people wanted to see. There's some much more unexpected things that have come out of it as well. So loads on community food growing and local food production, which is something that actually hadn't come out before. So it's really important to keep all these conversations going. And we've also made sure that the plan links in with all of Langham's wider community planning as well. So just a little bit on our 4 pillars and just a bit of work on how what we're starting to do in terms of delivery and projects. So people, most importantly, Langham feels the economic social benefits of community land, expanding our learning, discovery and skills building programme, growing and diversifying our community engagement activities, and providing a welcoming and diverse visitor experience. So they're the sort of 4 key things that we're trying to do under this theme, and how we're putting that into practice. So we've had every child in the area up on the community land now since we bought it. So that's right the way from nursery, right the way through to school leavers, really focusing on environmental education and those hands-on experiences with nature and the land, and linked in with the national curriculum as well, and using the land as an outdoor classroom for discovery and learning. And that goes right the way through to employability, rural skills opportunities, and also how we can support contractors and businesses as well. So for example, just recently we held a chainsaw training course using our woodlands for local forestry contractors. So they're all, wherever we can, supporting to upskill, using the land to upskill people and develop all of those different economic opportunities for people. And we're also looking at a focus on working together with other agencies across the town and the schools on how we can provide opportunities for young people who want to stay in the area. So we're particularly focused at the moment as providing work experience placements to boost CVs and get practical hands-on experience. We've been working hard on diversifying our community engagement and events program. So we've been trying to just do different things rather than just drop-ins, going to people who are busy, who might not have the time to come to every single session. So we've been doing things like dark skies events. We're looking at woodland yoga over the summer, sitting in co-op in the evening, catching people when they go and do their shopping. So it's really trying to get people involved who might not have the time to come to anything really in depth. And also growing our local volunteering program and seeing how we can develop income streams through our engagement activities to support like our core focus on schools and young people's outreach. So on to nature. So how are we looking at restoring ecosystems across the Taris Valley? So it's everything from looking at how we can restore woodlands to their natural limits, reconnecting the River Taris with its natural course, looking at how we can restore peatlands, wetlands across the valley, restorative grazing to encourage that dynamism in the ecosystem, and all to maximise biodiversity. So what does that look like at the moment? So here's just a snapshot of some of the things we're starting to do. So a really big element has been about just learning about the land, not rushing in straight away and trying to change everything and intervene. And it's actually been incredibly important to take stock of what we've got and start to really learn about the land and what does it need, where's the helping hand that it needs to start to restore. And that's going to take a long time, but that's okay. And really establishing for us what a nature-led approach looks like. So we have a lot of ancient forests and existing woodlands, so there has been some intervention we've needed to do there. So wherever we can, we've been using that as a way to get people involved, whether that's through training or skills, volunteering schools. Lots of tree planting being going on. We're trying to encourage natural regeneration as a primary means to expanding our woodlands, but there are areas where we need to go in and do a bit of enrichment or give things a helping hand. We also have bought a fair amount of commercial forestry that sits in the valley. So a lot of that's Sitka spruce and larch. So our biggest project to date was felling a 40-hectare Sitka spruce plantation, and that's going to be restored back to native woodland, which is really exciting. We've been looking at how we can expand our native tree nursery, providing all those stock of native trees that we want to plant through the valley, and again linking that back with skills. You know, we need to plant a lot of trees. We'd really like to build those skills within the area to sort of look at how we could potentially provide employment through woodland creation and enterprise. We've been working with the local fisheries trust to look at how we can restore the River Taris and what kind of projects we can develop over the next couple of years, whether that's remeandering or wetland creation. We've started to look at a whole landscape naturalistic grazing plan, very early days with that, and there's a lot of intricacies to, you know, putting something out into practice. But what we want that to do is focus on how we can transition our current upland hefted sheep farm to include more animals like cattle, ponies, to really focus on that dynamism and how we can use like grazing herbivores in the right densities to kickstart lost and damaged natural processes. And alongside that, really important part of that is herbivore impact assessment. Where do we have high grazing pressure? Where might be undergrazed, and starting to look at how we can do that. So it'll take time, but that's going to be an incredibly exciting part of how we restore the land, and a really important part. Climate. So how are we trying to make a meaningful contribution to the climate and ecological emergencies? Our primary means of doing this is obviously nature-based carbon capture. So where we're restoring the natural world, it'll become more resilient and be a better carbon sink. There was a lot of concern when we bought the land about wildfire, and I think that continues to be a concern in terms of how are we going to be prepared for for more extremes in our climate. And our answer to that is that, yes, we need to be prepared for incidents, and we are, but also it's about enhancing our natural resilience through restoring the system for drought, wildfire and flood. So where we can re-wet our peatlands, plant more woodland, restore natural processes that will ultimately make us more naturally resilient, and where we can contribute to local energy and food security. So how are we putting this into practice? We're number one, the biggest thing we've been working on since we bought the land is working with Scotland's National Peatland Action Programme to restore our degraded peatlands. We have a lot of them. This is in the bottom corner here. That's some of the headwaters. So there's some incredible blanket bog there, but it is really degraded, and we've got a lot of artificial drainage ditches running through our peatlands as well. So phase one, which we're hoping, if we get the funding through Nature Scot, is 190 hectares of ditch blocking. So that'll be 50 kilometres of drains that are going to be blocked this autumn. So that will be a massive win for creating wetland habitat in the uplands, but also linking back to that climate resilience, slowing the flow of water in the uplands, and natural mitigation for wildfire risk. And we're also looking at delivery of a 40 hectare upland native broadleaf low density scheme with the Woodland Trust as well. So just finally on to sustainability. So running responsibly, so we're here for the long haul. So this might seem the boring bit, but actually probably the most essential bit as well. So we've been doing an awful lot of work revisiting our business plans to look at how we build in financial resilience for our community land, and how can we develop sustainable and diverse income streams to make sure that we can keep making this happen, and investing in our back office finance admin systems. So we've had a huge step change in the organisation. We're a very small charity before this. Now we have 10,500 acres. So it's been a big change within the organisation. So we've had a bit of catching up to do with our back office systems as well. And also a really important part is actually making sure our buildings and our land, tracks, trails, fences, everything are well maintained as well, so that we can create a really welcoming and safe place for people to visit. So just a little bit on that before I end. So we have been a really big focus is about how we can support local businesses, venues, tradespeople in what we're doing. So where can we use local contractors? And we've been doing a lot of that. Just a quick bit of looking on our finance systems before our AGM this year. And it's not a lot. It doesn't feel a lot in the scale of things, but in the last year, the reserves contributed £50,000 to like local businesses and contractors. And we hope that that will increase as we grow and as we develop things, and that we'll continue to make that direct contribution to the local economy. And there's that wider indirect of people coming to stay and visit and using local businesses and hospitality venues. We are starting to look at how we can sustain our core community outreach work with paid experiences and visits and tours. It's early days with that, but we've been doing quite a lot of work on how we could develop that. We've also been looking at visitor infrastructure development. Like we're starting from the ground up with this one. So basic things like entrance signage. People, when they're coming to visit, don't know they've arrived at the community land. So we'll have signage up in the next couple of months. And also looking at sort of basic improvements to tracks and roads and things like that as well. We're also looking at how our existing housing stock, that little cottage in the right-hand corner, we're looking at developing that back into an energy efficient, affordable home for somebody locally. A big part of our plans going forward again is how we diversify our upland hefted sheep farm, which is relying on subsidies at the moment. Farming is a very important part of the area, so it's how we bridge those conversations together and look at how it could look in the future with how all the land subsidy systems are going to change. And we've also been looking at options, market analysis and appraisal for our empty properties to look at sort of sustainable tourism, business units and community growing. So there's an awful lot being done in terms of how we diversify and how we develop our economic opportunities as we go forward. And just finally sharing our story, that's been a really important part of what we've been doing, mainly to help share our story and hopefully inspire people and encourage participation from people who might not come and visit. So that's everything from social media, website, podcasts, press articles, and also how we can use drone mapping and digital media to monitor landscape change in a more engaging way. So we've already seen lots of changes on the land with more trees growing, And as we reblock ditches, it'll start to re-wet. So it's actually capturing that change in the land over time as well, which is a really important one. And also just for people who might not ever visit the reserve, being able to share our wildlife in really innovative ways. So we've been doing hen harrier tagging and barn owl cameras, trail cameras for wildlife, just trying to really make wildlife and the land accessible to people across the world. So that's it from me. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about our work at the Taris Valley. And if you've got any questions, please do ask. I'd be really interested to hear what you think. And a big thank you for listening.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Hetherington, and I work as the Nature Networks Manager for the Cairngorms National Park Authority. Now, the Cairngorms National Park, like everywhere in the UK, has not been immune to the impacts of human activity over many centuries. We've been subject to deforestation, the degradation of peatland habitats, the drainage of wetlands, the channelization of rivers, and indeed the loss of species. However, what I want to do over the course of this presentation is outline some of the exciting ecosystem restoration things that are being undertaken in the national park to tackle both the climate emergency and the biodiversity crisis. So the Cairngorms National Park, which was established in 2003, is the largest UK national park at 4,500 square kilometres. It's twice the size of the next largest, which is the Lake District National Park. It's home to a quarter of the UK's threatened species, and it's a Category 5 protected landscape, which means it's a cultural landscape that's worked and farmed and inhabited by up to 18,500 people. So it's far from being an uninhabited wilderness. The national park has at its core the largest area of Arctic alpine environment in the British Isles. It has 4 of the UK's 5 highest mountains within it as well. It has various bits of river catchment from the River Spey on the west side of the national park, parts of the River Tay catchment on the southwestern side. On the southeastern side, we have the rivers North Esk and South Esk, and on the east, we have the rivers Dee and Don. Now, the National Park Authority doesn't own or directly manage any of the national park. It's a real mosaic of different land ownership and land ownership types. We have public land, we've got land owned by conservation NGOs, but most of the land is managed by private estates. And those private estates are a broad church. Some of them are only really managing for sport. Some are managing primarily for ecosystem restoration. And there's a groundswell in between where they're managing for a diverse portfolio of farming, forestry, sport, tourism, and nature conservation. The vision for ecosystem restoration in the Cairngorms National Park is best encapsulated in the current National Park Partnership Plan by our 50 by 45 target. Now, you may have heard of 30 by 30. That's an international initiative to ensure that 30% of the world's land and seas are protected for nature by 2030. Now, that will apply everywhere, including in Scotland, right across Scotland. But what we have specific to the Cairngorms National Park is an endeavour that at least 50% of the park should be managed principally for ecosystem restoration by 2045. So a longer timescale, but a bigger proportion of the park. And arguably, we're taking up a notch or two. It's not just managing for nature, it's managing principally for ecosystem restoration. And in terms of what that looks like on the map, it's likely to be a mix of national nature reserves, entire land holdings that are managed largely for nature, and restoration sites. That's parts of estates that are being managed for example, peatland restoration or woodland expansion. The running total currently sits at around about 27% or so. So in order to hit 50% by 2045, we're needing to add roughly 1% per annum on average in order to hit that target. And that looks something like this. It gives you a rough idea of what it could look like. The blue, orange, red, and green areas are those entire land holdings that are being managed principally for ecosystem restoration. And the purple areas show where parts of estates are being managed for things like woodland creation or peatland restoration. The other big ticket item, I guess, that's pertinent to a discussion about ecosystem restoration is nature networks. And again, this isn't something that's unique to the national park. In Scotland, each local authority and both national parks will have to have a spatially defined nature network. And that's to say a nature network of core areas of nature-rich sites that are connected to one another by ecological corridors and or stepping stones. And of course, remembering that the national park is not an island, this nature network needs to join up with other nature networks across Scotland, including the 5 local authorities that surround the national park, each of which has its own nature network. So that's all about habitat connectivity and trying to make nature more resilient and more robust. One habitat we're really keen to see more of in the national park, remembering that we have had a great deal of deforestation over many centuries, is woodland. And of course, woodland in the Cairngorms happens to be very rich from a biodiversity point of view. Since the national park came into being in 2003, we've seen a substantial increase from 14% cover to 19.2%. And that increase of 23,500 hectares is equivalent in scale to creating 6 new Abernethy forests. Abernethy Forest being a woodland here in the Cairngorms, which is one of the biggest native pine woods that we have in Scotland. And that's what that looks like. The yellow areas show woodland in 2002, and the green areas show the expansion by April 2024, bearing in mind that some of that woodland by 2024 had been approved by Scottish Forestry, but had not yet necessarily been implemented on the ground. Nevertheless, since April, I know that there has been some new woodlands that have been approved by Scottish Forestry that will be implemented in the next year or two. So it's an ongoing process of woodland expansion, which is just as well, because the target in the park plan is to increase woodland by at least 35,000 hectares by 2045. So that's another 9 Abernethy forests in scale, if you like. At least 80% of this new woodland should be native, and I don't foresee a problem in hitting that particular objective, given that in the last 6 or 7 years, about 96% of the new woodland in the national park has been native. So quite a distinctive thing about woodland in the national park is the preponderance of native woodland. Another distinctive feature is the amount of woodland happening through natural regeneration. And again, our target is that at least 10,000 hectares of the 35 should be via natural regeneration. So not using planting and fencing, but using deer control to bring deer populations down to a level that seed sources can naturally regenerate. And to give you some idea of how that might shape up, here's a photograph I took of a rather lonely granny pine in Glenfeshie in the year 2000. The Glenfeshie at that time had no natural regeneration out with any fenced areas. It was, if you like, an old folks' home for trees, lots of grannies, but no children. Fast forward to 2018, and that particular granny pine is now busily babysitting a whole new generation of trees. And indeed, that regeneration is not restricted to pines. It's a whole range of broadleaf species as well, and it's a whole length and breadth of the glen. And indeed, that's a picture that we're seeing in an increasing number of estates across the park, including at Abernethy, including at Mar Lodge, and others. I guess we're also really keen to see woodland expansion happening in a strategic way across the national park. We would love to see greater habitat connectivity, not just for woodland, but for all species. But in the case of woodland, we could be strengthening a woodland habitat network across the park by creating new habitat corridors. And these red areas on this map show some of the potential corridors there could be that would connect woodland across catchment boundaries. So the purple lines indicate the boundaries of the river catchments. All of these red corridors actually straddle watercourses, and some of them actually go over quite high ground, which still has the potential for woodland, albeit it would be a montane woodland. And again, that's something that we're really keen to see in the national park, more natural tree lines and restore missing montane woodland habitats. And we can get some idea of the potential for that and what they might look like by looking at a parallel universe just across the North Sea in southwest Norway, where the climate, the geology, the landforms and the altitudes are all eerily similar to the Cairngorms. And there the Scots pine woodlands go much higher up the hill. Not only that, they have a fairly significant proportion of broadleaves, including downy birch within them. And the downy birch keeps going further up the hill when the pine trees fizzle out. So we can see an open, scrubby birch zone extending to well above 1,000 meters in some place, which looks really quite rich and vibrant, despite it growing at high altitude on poor peaty soils. It's home to a rich array of species, including many species of plant, and indeed a rich bird life, which combines woodland birds with some of those species that we perhaps associate more with moorlands here in the UK. So it's a real sweet spot between open and wooded habitats, that sort of scrubby montane birch woodland, which exists in a real mosaic with peatland, such as you can see in this photograph. So talking of peatland then, peatland restoration is another main plank of what we're trying to do in terms of the restoration activity within the national park. A great deal of the national park is covered in peatland, and much of that, in fact, the majority of it, is degraded in some way. This map indicates with the orange and yellow areas where we have eroded peat, and the blue areas show where we've got drained peat. So both those types of degraded peat can be subject to restoration activity. Indeed, in the last 10 years, we've restored over 5,500 hectares of damaged peatland. And in fact, the speed of that is really ramping up. A quarter of that restoration activity was carried out just last year alone, which is just as well because we have a stretch goal of restoring over 38,000 hectares of damaged peatland by 2045. River restoration is also something that we're working well with our partners, specifically the fishery boards and the river trust. We have several impressive salmon rivers, the Spey, the Dee, the Tay, the South Esk, and all of those rivers are also highly designated as special areas of conservation. But we know with climate change that they face a whole variety of challenges, from rising water temperatures, particularly in those treeless headwater streams running through the mountains. We're seeing temperatures rising above the threshold at which salmonids start to shut down and die. The other issues, of course, we've got very low water at some points. When we've got droughts, we can have really intense flooding events, which wrought a great deal of changes in the environment and can negatively affect aquatic life. So we need to make our rivers more resilient and more robust to the changes that are underway. Now, one way of doing that is to create more riparian woodland. By planting trees along riverbanks, what we're effectively doing in time as they grow up is creating shade over the watercourse and helping to keep the temperatures lower and fitter places for aquatic life to be in. And of course, riparian woodland will then put leaf litter into the watercourse in due course. That will ultimately break down and will feed invertebrates. The tree's roots will help bind the riverbanks together and buffer them against erosion. And of course, inadvertently, what we're also doing is creating sort of long, sinuous woodlands that snake through otherwise treeless landscapes and could actually enhance woodland connectivity across the national park. We're really keen to, as you can see, we're really keen to explore that idea of corridors across the landscape. And if we look at number 4, that is a landscape that has recently been subject to riparian woodland creation on the Mar Lodge estate. Quite large areas of riparian woodland are there to buffer the headwaters of the River Dee, but in so doing, what they're doing is strengthening a corridor between two of the biggest native woodland landscapes in Scotland, the native woodlands of Badenoch and Strathspey to the west, and we're connecting them with the woodlands of Deeside to the east. So that's a really exciting development. We're also looking to connect rivers with their floodplains where that's feasible and desirable. In some places, removing embankments to allow the river and its floodplain to function once more. And in so doing, we're creating more and more wetland habitat in the floodplain, for example, by creating wader scrapes. The national park is an important place for farmland waders such as curlew, oystercatcher, lapwing, redshank, and snipe. And creating scrapes in the floodplain is a great way of creating ideal conditions for those wading bird species. We're also looking to sensitively insert large woody structures, that's dead trees with their root plates, engineer them into the riverbeds to create a bit of heterogeneity, deeper, colder areas that have been scoured out that can be resting areas for aquatic life and give them shelter from both predators and from rising water temperatures. We're also looking to remove barriers to fish migration, perhaps replacing culverts with bridges, taking out weirs that might be a problem for migrating, say, sea trout and salmon, for example. And really, in the last couple of years, we've seen something like 73 kilometres of river restoration undertaken across the national park. And we've got aspirations to do much more of that with our various partner organisations. Now, we can't really talk about river restoration without talking about this species here, the Eurasian beaver. It's been missing from the rivers of the Cairngorms National Park for several centuries, but last year, rather excitingly, an application to NatureScot to restore or to reintroduce 15 families into the River Spey was successful, and that work began in the week before Christmas. The first of 6 families were released into the River Spey. That represents the first official reintroduction of beavers into a major river ecosystem in the UK. So a really exciting milestone in ecological restoration here in the Cairngorms to have this species back. It's a well-known ecosystem engineer whose dam building behaviour helps to create wetlands which are beneficial to a wide range of species. So it's great for biodiversity, but of course their dams can help by impounding water, help slow the flow during periods of high flow, but also help store water in the landscape during periods of drought. So a great ally in the fight against climate change. We do, however, accept that beavers can create problems now and then for land managers, and that's something we need to keep a close eye on and try and mitigate those impacts if and when they arise. One other furry critter that we've been busily releasing into the national park in the last year or so is the wildcat. We've been working with our partners at the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, who lead on the Saving Wildcats project. They've been successfully captive rearing and releasing from their the state-of-the-art captive breeding centre at the Highland Wildlife Park wildcats into the wider national park. Last summer saw the release of 19 wildcats into the park. 18 of those cats are still alive today, which far surpasses our expectations and hopes. And we're looking to see further releases taking place this summer and indeed the summer after that. So that's an exciting development to restore wildcat populations to the Cairngorms. But it's not all exciting, charismatic megafauna. We're also looking at some of the perhaps less well-known, less well-championed species, such as the dark-bordered beauty moth on the top left there, the pine hoverfly in the top right. Both of those species are vanishingly rare. The Cairngorms is a real stronghold, last stronghold for the species in a UK context. They're both highly specialised in their ecological requirements. The dark-bordered beauty moth needs young aspen suckers, and the pine hoverfly needs rotten pine stumps. So again, working with the Royal Zoological Society, we've been working to do captive breeding of the species and translocate them into the wild, whilst at the same time improving the habitat requirements that they need. We've also been working with partners such as Plant Life and the Royal Botanic Gardens of Edinburgh to diversify the genetics of two, again, very typical Cairngorms plants, which are found rarely elsewhere. One is the twin flower, a beautiful, delicate little plant of the floor of the pine woods, and the alpine blue sow-thistle there on the right, on the bottom right, a plant that has only been found in recent times on 4 inaccessible cliff ledges in the Cairngorms. Of course, that's not their favoured habitat, that's their refugee habitat, where centuries of high grazing pressures have allowed them to live, but they could be living much more widely and more lower down as well. So translocations following captive breeding work have seen that both those species, their genetics have been diversified and the species spread around the landscape a bit more. Raptors is a group of species that have, in the park, been subject to a great deal of human pressures over the centuries. There's probably something like 14 species of native breeding raptor that we should have in the Cairngorms National Park. But by the beginning of the 20th century, that had probably been whittled down to something like just 5 or 6. But over the course of the 20th century and indeed the early 21st century, we've seen several of those species returning, including these two, the red kite on the left and the sea eagle on the right. Both have been subject to reintroductions elsewhere in northern Scotland and have started to recolonise the national park from those areas. So in the last few years, we've seen both species now breeding in the park once again, which is tremendously exciting. And we're now back up to about 13 of those 14 species now breeding in the park. So it's not all sweetness and light. Clearly, some of these species are far from being at their carrying capacity, so we've got a long way to go with them yet, but the signs are very encouraging. And we're just waiting for the marsh harrier to come back and start breeding, and then we'll have our full suite of raptors back breeding in the national park. Anyway, I will leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention. Bye.
Hi there, everybody out there. My name's Alan Watson Featherstone, and I'm very pleased and honoured to be the keynote speaker at this event on Rewilding Hope. My thanks to Sharon and the other organisers for the invitation and for making what I think is going to be a very inspiring and productive and creative event. So just a bit of background about me. I live in the Findhorn community in the northeast of Scotland. I've been here since 1978. And I'm best known probably for founding the conservation charity Trees for Life, which I started in 1986, and I worked with that for 31 years. The charity is still going now, going stronger than ever, although I've not been part of it for the last 6 years. And it's doing work to restore the Caledonian forest in the North Central Highlands, centred on Glen Affric and Dundregan, the estate the charity bought in 2008. These days I'm an independent spirit. I lead rewilding workshops, I give lectures and talks, I'm working on an online course about restoring temperate forests, and I do a lot of biodiversity photography. So that's a quick introduction to myself. Moving into this presentation, I'm going to talk about rewilding and ecological restoration, which I believe has to become the essential work for all humanity in the 21st century. So I want to start with this photograph, which probably you've all seen before, the Earth from space, taken by Apollo 8 astronauts in 1968. This is our shared home, Gaia, as Jim Lovelock called it, the living planet. And you can see here the outline of the African continent, Antarctica at the bottom, Madagascar and the Arabian Peninsula at the top. This is our home, this is our shared world. All of humanity lives there, plus all the other millions of species that share the planet with us. So why do we need to rewild? Well, the planet is not in good shape at the moment. I have a particular interest in forests, so I've done a lot of research. I've visited forests all over the world, and you can see here the Caledonian forest in Scotland. We've got 1% left, but look at the other forests, redwoods in California, the Atlantic forest in Brazil, which is separate from the Amazon, the Philippines rainforest, the famous cedars of Lebanon, dry tropical forest in Central America, kauri forest in New Zealand. Tiny percentages of those are all that's left. We've used up most of the world's forests, and of course we're still destroying intact, healthy forests today in Tasmania, the Amazon, Borneo, and so forth. Gone with the forests are much of the wildlife, and most people grow up with the shifting baseline syndrome. They don't realize how much has already been lost. These are a few things that we know of from statistics and records that have been kept from the past. American bison, 30 million reduced to 1,000, and you can see a photograph of the bison skulls there. Tigers reduced from 100,000 beginning of the last century to 5,000 and a few today. Spider monkey in Brazil, the Juan Fernandez fur seal, southern right whale, all reduced to tiny proportions of what their original populations were, and that's just symbolic of what's happening. Humanity has wiped out almost 70% of the world's wildlife since 1970. Just let that sink in. That's what we're doing to the world today. And of course, we're driving species to extinction. We're now in the planet's 6th mass extinction event, this time caused entirely by humans, not by an asteroid like the one that hit the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico 66 million years ago and wiped out the dinosaurs. Today, we're doing it. We've lost the Pyrenean ibex in the year 2000, rhinoceros in Cameroon in 2006, the Yangtze River dolphin there in a photograph in 2006 probably, the golden toad in Costa Rica just a few years ago. And this is symbolic of what's happening. We're losing an estimated 150 species a day to extinction, most of them probably not known or named by science. And the last untouched ecosystems of the planet are being converted to human use. Here on the left, we've got a photograph of the former Gran Chaco forest in northwest Argentina, converted to soya plantations, not to produce tofu for people, but to provide fodder for cattle. And on the other side, oil palm plantations taking the place of tropical rainforests in Borneo. And wildlife, indigenous people, and all the essential ecological functions that the health of the planet depends upon are being lost. This is what I call the enslavement of the planet to human purposes, to human greed in most cases. Bringing it home to Scotland, the photograph on the right here is one of the things that inspired me to start the work to restore the Caledonian forest. You can see there a dead Scots pine in Strathfarrer. That's 2 valleys north of Glenafric in the north central Highlands. And you can see a standing dead pine in an otherwise treeless landscape. Look in the left-hand photograph, southern Venezuela, the same thing, 2 dead trees in a burned gallery forest. So we're living on a heavily depleted planet. And a lot of conservation action today is focused on stopping the destruction, which is essential. But beyond that, we've actually got to engage in restoration and rewilding. We've got to bring back the life-carrying capacity of the planet, both for all other species and indeed to support humanity in the future as well. So if we go back to this photograph of the Earth from space that I started with, I don't know how many of you have noticed this, but I've looked at this many times, and one time, many years ago now, I realized the most prominent feature on that photograph is deserts. And you can see at the top of the photograph there, the Arabian Peninsula, North Africa, the Horn of Africa. Further south you can see the Kalahari, and to the right of that, Madagascar. And deserts are natural ecosystems on the planet, but most of what we see in that photograph today is desertified land, areas that have been depleted by humans. We know, for example, at the top of the photograph there, North Africa 2,000 years ago was richly forested, and in those forests lived species like the Barbary lion, which had the largest mane of any lion species in the world, and the Atlas bear in the Atlas Mountains. Both are now extinct and the area is desertified. It was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago. So this quote from Chateaubriand, excuse me, this quote from Chateaubriand, forests precede civilizations and deserts follow them. That's what we've inherited from the past. That's what we're still engaged in today. And in Scotland, the famous conservationist Sir Frank Fraser-Darling described in the 1950s the Highlands of Scotland as a wet desert. I took this photograph in India a few years ago because this shows the trajectory of our modern world. You can see here this poster in Bangalore with people sitting in plush armchairs looking at a giant TV screen, and it says, "Experience the real lifestyle." That's what is promulgated to people all over the planet today, and it's endless economic growth to justify that. And it's now 52 years after the publication of the Club of Rome's report, The Limits to Growth, but every government in the world today is still committed to the insane philosophy of endless economic growth. And this is a quote from this week, actually. Some of you may have seen this on the Guardian website just 3 days ago. Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, who will become Chancellor if the Labour Party wins the next election, and she has stated that she's vowing to lead the most pro-growth Treasury in UK history. The only place where endless growth occurs in nature is the disease we call cancer. And cancerous cells grow out of balance with the rest of the body that they're feeding in, and in most cases, not all, but in many cases, they end up killing their host. And our endless economic growth culture is a cancer on the planet today, and that is what has to change. So I want to shift now gears and focus for the rest of this presentation on the more positive aspect of it, and I want to make that shift by quoting one of the well-known indigenous leaders from North America. This quote attributed to Chief Seattle. "This we know, all things are connected like the blood which unites one family. All things are connected. Whatever befalls the earth befalls the sons of the earth. Man did not weave the web of life, he is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself." And I think many people are aware of that. When we poison and pollute and deplete the earth, we're actually impoverishing our own lives as well. But actually, the converse is also true. When we work to restore the web, when we work to heal the links and reconnect things, we reconnect ourselves and heal ourselves as well. So rewilding, or ecological restoration, is the work which reconnects. And it's a natural process. I took these photographs when I was in Chile a number of years ago. And the one on the left shows a whole forest that was destroyed by a massive eruption of the Chaiten volcano in 2008, just left with charred ash and the standing trunks of the trees. By the time I was there in 2015, Pioneer species such as Gunnera, the big leaf on the bottom right of the right-hand photograph, and fuchsias further up were already established and young trees were growing. That's the Earth's natural ability to recover after a massive disturbance like a volcanic eruption. And this has been seen at Mount St. Helens in the US and other places as well. So the Earth is a living organism, and just as if I injure myself, if I cut my hand, my body will create a scab over the wound and the skin will heal and I will recover. The Earth has this remarkable ability to heal its own wounds as well. And that's what ecological restoration or rewilding is all about. It's about assisting and in some cases accelerating that natural healing process. And this was what I started to get involved with in Scotland in the 1980s. The photograph on the left here, taken in Glenafric in 1989, these 3 standing dead Scots pines, or snags as they're called, they persist for decades because they have a lot of resin in them. And you can see a few living trees in the background, but no young seedlings growing to replace the dead ones. And that was because too many deer, with the absence of no predators, and wolves and lynx being extinct in Scotland, too many herbivores eating every tree, and we had this huge generation gap. Old and dying trees, what I call the geriatric forest, and no new life growing to take its place. Like going to an old people's home and seeing no babies, no children, no teenagers, no young adults, only old people at the end of their lives. So I raised enough money to pay for a fence to keep the deer out. And the picture on the right shows exactly the same scene in 2023. So that's 34 years later. And you can see there that the standing pine I'm next to in the right-hand photograph is almost unchanged from 1989. But all those young pines are the ones which grew naturally. We didn't plant them. The seedlings were already there, getting eaten by deer. As soon as the deer pressure was removed, they could grow freely. And you can see life has returned. This is the Earth's natural healing ability. All we need to do is help it and assist it, in this case by putting up a fence to keep the deer out. Then nature does the job herself. And that's the best option for rewilding. That's not always possible though. So here, this is further west in Glenafric where there were no living trees left, but you can see on the left a volunteer in one of Trees for Life's first ever work weeks in 1991, about to plant a pine seedling he's holding by his planting bag next to an old stump. The forest was there 100 years ago, but no living trees in sight then. And on the right, taken 2 years ago, that's me standing beside the same tree that he planted, and just to the right of the tree you can just about make out the stump. It's still there, but it's almost completely covered now by heather, because deer don't just eat trees, they eat heather, they eat all the vegetation, which is what you see on the left. It's browsed down to ½ an inch or so in height. And when they were excluded and these trees were planted, everything recovers. The trees grow, the heather, the flowering plants, the understory, the blaeberry, it all comes back. Life returns. So restoration is the work which heals. It enables life to flourish again. And this photograph here, taken from the same area as the previous one, shows the fence which keeps the deer out. And just look at the difference inside on the right and outside on the left. Outside on the left you've just got grass, and inside on the right you've got heather in bloom there. There's lots of birch and rowan trees all spontaneously growing. Those were not planted. The seeds came by themselves and were free to grow once the grazing pressure was removed. This is the transformation that happens when we allow the Earth's natural healing process to unfold and take place without excessive imbalance of overgrazing from far too many deer. And as the vegetation recovers, so does all the other life. The vegetation supports all other life. So you get insects coming in, as you can see in some of these photographs here. A caterpillar eating an alder leaf, soldier beetles mating on a birch leaf. There's a green hair-streaked butterfly, and then the birds come and they feed on the insects, and then you get the raptors that come and catch the small birds, and the whole web of life begins to restore and reweave itself when we give nature a chance to have our own healing process underway. So that's the essence of rewilding, and I summarize it in terms of 3 main elements which I've itemized here in this slide. The first is the restoration of healthy vegetation communities, as we've seen with the recovery of the trees. The second is reinstatement of key ecological processes, things like natural ecological succession, the development from one community to another, First you get pioneer trees, then you get later successional ones like oak and pine coming in. Nutrient cycling. We've got ongoing nutrient loss in most of the highlands today because deer are shot and their carcasses are exported and nothing is ever put back. Natural disturbance, occasional wind throw or things like that, and predator-prey dynamics, which are absent in most of Scotland and many other countries now too, because predators have been persecuted for so long. Then the third element is the reintroduction of missing species, which may include rare plants and all the way up to large mammals and apex predators. And we've now got beavers back in Scotland in some places, and there's quite a strong movement to bring back the lynx as the first of our missing predators. So if we combine these three elements, we get healthy, self-sustaining natural ecosystems again. And you can see the recovery of the forest there in that photograph. Still a dead pine standing in the middle in the background, but look at all the new life that's coming in the foreground. So that's what I've been involved with since the mid-1980s, and simultaneously many other projects have sprung up, and more even in recent years. In the last decade or so it's really snowballed. This photograph here is from the Carriffran Valley in the southeast of Scotland. Philip Ashmole there, a friend of mine, he and his wife arranged the purchase of a whole valley with no trees in it, and they've planted it up, and it's a wonderful demonstration project. There's a man in the southwest of Ireland restoring temperate rainforests to the Beara Peninsula. We've got sea eagles successfully reintroduced to Rum in 1975 and now spreading to other sites. And of course we've got beavers back in various places in Britain from 2009 onwards. And all these restoration projects, they've largely been set up by inspired individuals. They're not things set up by big organizations or governments or anything like that. It's people who care for the land that they live on and are close to and felt they needed to do something to make a difference. And it's not just in Britain. Restoration projects have sprung up in many parts of the world because a similar situation is faced in all countries. This man here, Dan Jansen, he's an American scientist studying the dry tropical forests of Costa Rica, and they were all getting burned to create cattle pasture, and he realized if he didn't do something, he'd have nothing to study. So he stopped the burning, and that's what you see behind him there, all the forest recovering. It's dry forest in the dry season, so there's no leaves. And on the left of the photograph, his control plot, where it's burned every year, only grass. So we've got restoration projects in the Atlantic forest of Brazil, reintroduction of Arabian oryx in Oman, mangroves being restored in India and Vietnam, very important. Those are the coastal forests and tropical regions, and dam removals in various parts of the world. And a few other examples. This photograph here from Tamil Nadu in the southeast of India, tropical dry evergreen forest, mostly destroyed. And this is a critically endangered tree being replanted as part of its restoration. Round Island of Mauritius, restoration taking place there, the famous reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone, removal of invasive rats in South Georgia, and the Loess Plateau in China, another famous restoration project on a large scale there. So this is just a sampling. There's many, many more taking place. It is a global movement now. And that's reflected by the fact that the UN has declared this decade, the years 2021 to 2030, a decade on ecosystem restoration. So it's a global priority for all nations of the world to engage in this. And that's really inspiring to see. For many years, I had a project here to have the 21st century declared the century of restoring the earth, because it's going to take at least 100 years. That wasn't successful, but in some way, maybe it fed into this decade of restoration being declared by the UN instead. Just want to offer a slightly different perspective now, because for this to be successful, there needs to be major changes in human culture today. As I indicated at the beginning, we're heading for disaster. So some of you may know this book by Daniel Quinn, Ishmael. A very interesting book. It's a novel, and it starts with a man answering an ad in a newspaper in San Francisco. And the ad says, "Teacher seeks pupil, must have an earnest desire to save the world, apply in person." So the narrator of the story turns up at the address that's given, and he finds there's a gorilla there who is telepathic, calls himself Ishmael, and he proceeds to give the narrator a gorilla's perspective of humans and what we've done to the world. And Ishmael defines humans as two different categories: the leavers, the hunter-gatherer peoples, who essentially left the earth as they found it and left very little trace of themselves. And then, since the rise of settled agriculture, Ishmael calls the rest of us, which what we are all today, the takers. We've been taking more from the earth than it can sustain. So that's a really inspiring book. I recommend it if you haven't read it. And that's the gist of it. And when I thought about it, I thought, well, we know there's no future for the takers. We can't go on taking and taking and taking. We're heading for destruction. But also we can't go back to being the leavers. Even if we wanted to become hunter-gatherers again, the earth could not support 8 billion hunter-gatherers, just not physically possible. So we have to become something new, in my view, and that is we have to become the givers. We have to learn to give back more than we take. I still obviously have to take. I have to eat food every day. I have clothes to wear. My house is a passive solar house, but it still needs some heat. So I'm taking something from the earth, but it's important that I give back more than I take. So what can we give? That's how we will transform our culture into something new. So there are 3 main things I think we can give to other species and the planet. First is space. We need to reduce our demands on the earth to free up enough space for the estimated 5 million other species that thrive on the planet today. If we want them to survive, we need to give them space, because at the moment we're still destroying their habitats. We need to give life back, and that's what restoration and rewilding is all about. It's about helping this healing process of the planet that I've described. And then the third thing, I believe, is we have to give love back to the planet. This is something that all indigenous peoples have important to their cultures, and we need to learn to give the same love to Gaia, the living earth, as we give to children and pets. And many people, I think, know this, that love nurtures all life. Anybody who's a parent knows their children flourish in an atmosphere of love. Pets respond to love. And if somebody has a special way with plants, we say they have a green thumb. This actually should be green heart, because it's the heart that makes the difference. So the work I've been engaged in is also about giving love back to the earth. And I took this photograph here in a visit to Chile a few years ago, this young couple spontaneously hugging a 1,000-year-old tree, giving their love and connecting with it. So those 3 things combined will form the basis of this new culture, in my view. For it to be successful, though, we need to free up enough space for wildlife to live wild again, that first one on the list there. So at the moment, much of our demands on the planet is taken up by supporting our lifestyle. And the single best way we can do to address that is by shifting from a meat and dairy-based diet to a plant-based diet. I've been vegan since 1979 because I discovered then it took 10% of the land to provide my food as it would for a meat and dairy-based diet. And you can see in these photographs here the impact of that meat and dairy-based diet on the planet. So that's one way to make an important shift. Each individual can, you don't need to go all the way, but if you shift most of the way, that will still make a significant contribution. This map here, maybe you might have seen it, it's had a lot of publicity recently. It shows how much land is used for different purposes in Britain. And the green areas are all for beef and lamb pastures, dairy pastures, and feedstock for them. And you can see that's most of the land. And up on the top, you've got broadleaf woods and conifers. And then the bit in Northern Ireland is for poultry and pigs. So the vast majority of land in Britain is used for supporting meat and dairy-based diets. So if we want to free up land for rewilding, we have to shrink that. And the hexagons show the land elsewhere that also provides food for Britain. And again, it's dominated by meat and dairy. So that's the single most important thing I believe anybody can do to make a shift towards a more sustainable future. So finally, then, I just want to say a little bit about how that new future will look compared to our present culture. And I've picked out a few characteristics that I use to define our present culture. So for me, it treats the planet as a resource. And in a new culture, we have to see that Mother Earth is our home and is alive. Gaia is a living organism within which we have our own lives. Instead of looking at nature as a machine, we need to look at nature as an interdependent web, and we are part of that independent web. Instead of people being separate from place, we need to have people being rooted in place again, deeply connected. That's how I started the work in Glen Affric to restore the Caledonian forest, by developing a deep connection, a heart connection with that place. Instead of no knowledge of the local environment, people should have deep knowledge of their local environment, their local ecosystems, and what they need to be healthy. Short-term thinking needs to be replaced by the seventh generation perspective that many Indigenous people still live by. And instead of no responsibility for the future, we need to see ourselves as caretakers of the future. We need to pass the planet on in a better state of health and vitality than we've inherited it from the previous generations. Instead of endless economic growth, our purpose should be restoring the earth and nurturing all life. And instead of happiness being determined by goods, happiness gained from creativity and service. Instead of seeing the earth belonging to people, people belong to the earth. And humans should not be superior to all other species. All beings, in my view, should have equal rights to live. All are part of the living fabric of Gaia and have a unique role and contribution to make. And education should no longer be for business as usual, but to draw out our inner potential. What is it that we have in our hearts? What is our passion and our purpose that we can offer to the planet? And instead of power over others, empowering ourselves and others, finding our inner power to make a positive difference in the world. So these are a few ways in which I see our culture urgently needs to be transformed. And if we put these into practice, we will find our power to make a positive difference in the world. Be positive in our thoughts and actions. Follow your passion by taking positive action on what you feel passionate about. Align that with the purpose of restoring the earth, of rewilding hope. And that liberates the power within each of us to help heal our degraded planet. And this is just one example. Greta Thunberg, a teenage schoolgirl with Asperger's syndrome, who decided to make a statement about addressing the threat of climate breakdown. And she's touched and inspired millions of people. We each have access to that same power within ourselves if we follow our hearts, find our passion, and dedicate our life purpose towards that end. So finally then, I just want to end by saying what I think I mentioned along the way. For me, the first shared task of all humanity must surely be to help heal our degraded planet. We've never had a task that unites all peoples, all nations, all cultures before. It's still competition, who's going to get ahead in the economy and all that. We need to set that aside and come together to help repair, heal, and revitalize the one thing we have in common, Gaia, planet Earth. We've got this decade on ecosystem restoration. Let's see that as the starting point of a much longer process, because it will take many, many decades to bring it back to full health. And all life and future generations of people depend on the decisions we make today. We literally hold the future of all life in our hands, as that central illustration shows there. So my last slide then is just to imagine, what would that look like if that comes to pass? Well, just imagine a century of restoring the earth, a century of rewilding hope. So here's a couple of things that already happened. 2009, European beavers have been reintroduced to Scotland. They're now in England as well. In 2012, Iceland got all of its electricity from renewable sources, hydro and geothermal, already done. So let's stretch ahead and see what we could see if this positive future unfolds. How about this? Next year we have Eurasian lynx reintroduced to Scotland. There's quite a head of steam of momentum to make this happen now. 2028, could we imagine a world declared free of landmines that still damage many areas and destroy people's lives everywhere, and especially in poor countries? Can we eliminate the use of trees for making paper? What a crime to cut down a tree, as they're doing in Tasmania at the moment. They're hundreds of years old to make paper. Used once and thrown away. 2039, renewable energy supplies most of the world's electricity. We're heading in that direction already. How about this? 2043, the Ganges River in India, clean enough to drink, the holy city of Benares. It's not safe to swim in at the moment because it's so polluted. Can we imagine tiger numbers returning to 25,000 in the wild? 5 times what we've got today, but still only a quarter of what they were at the beginning of the last century. The ecological conversion of the world's major cities completed, 2074, that's ambitious. 2086, half of the earth is protected for nature and other species. That would mean humanity still had half of the planet, one species, but at least we'd be sharing it with all other species still alive in the world. And could we imagine blue whales, the largest creatures ever to have lived on the planet, much bigger than any dinosaurs, recovering to their pre-exploitation levels? We have everything we need to create this future. We know how to do it. We've got the skills. All we need is the commitment and the action to make it happen, to really turn our world around. And that's the message I want to leave you with. That's the message of Rewilding Hope. We can determine the future. We can make it a positive one. Thank you very much.